No, just, okay.
Yes, because they are going to call our guests, our distinguished guests, for the welcome remarks. Thank you.
So, it is a great privilege and a real pleasure is it, to be here today. Okay, sorry. Is it better? Okay. So, it is a great privilege, a real pleasure indeed, to be here today with all the distinguished guests who accepted to contribute to the Conference on Cultural Heritage, and with this highly qualified public attending in presence or on YouTube. After reminding you that time management is fundamental for the success of our conference, and as well as speaking slowly, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Andrea Simoncini to take the floor for the official welcome. Unfortunately, Professor Deborah Berti is ill and she cannot attend. This has been said to me.
So, thank you, Alessandra, and welcome everybody. As director of the Department of the Legal Science of the University of Florence, I'm really honored and pleased to welcome all of you today here in Villa Ruspoli for this conference on the Italian law of cultural heritage, a dialogue with the United States. I want especially express all my gratitude to Alessandra De Luca, Lucrezia Palandri, Giacomo Pailli, who about 1 year ago had the idea of organizing here in Florence with the support and the supervision of the law school and the Superintendenza delle Belle Arti, this cross-border and cross-disciplinary dialogue to promote the international debate on the Italian law of cultural heritage, a body of law that whose principles and peculiarities are still largely unknown and outside Italy, but I would say also within our country, the knowledge is not so, sometimes not so high. So I think it is really remarkable, this academic effort, trying to set a common ground in language to foster further knowledge and study in this field. And this is why I immediately decided to support as department and to include this project among the final celebrations of the excellence program of our department. Our department has been awarded of this important award, national award on research and academic achievements, and I'm really proud that this project can be included in this year that is the final year of this 5 years program. I think that if you take a quick look to the program of today's conference, and I take this opportunity of, again, greeting and welcoming and thanking all the distinguished guests and speakers that we are going to listen, you may understand how deep and how fruitful has been this work, and a special thank, again, goes to the Superintendenza in the name of the Jennifer Celani and the Superintendent Andrea Pessina. Florence indeed is quite a special place to start this international dialogue on cultural heritage for many reasons, but probably the most important one is that all the history of Florence is the demonstration that its immense cultural heritage is a unique opportunity for relationship, for dialogue, for comparison, for learning. Art and culture are always opportunity of dialogue. Using culture to build walls, to end relations, or even worse, to create enemies, it means that we are not truly speaking of culture. This city and our university are founded on this relational capacity of education. And Florence, that as you know, invites every year and now starts again after this 2 years of the lockdown, invites visitors from all over the world, tourists, students, scholars from different countries, all attracted by its cultural heritage. This is probably one of the reasons why Florence developed also a prestigious and still very active school of comparative law that traces back from its founder, Professor Cappelletti, whom many of you certainly know, to the present generation of comparative lawyers led by Vittoria and all the others. So I will take no more time, and so I wish you an insightful and productive conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Simoncini. I would like to invite Professor Vittoria Barsotti and ask her to give her welcome.
Thank you, Alessandra. Well, the official welcome session today is unusually crowded, and I think this testifies the relevance and the innovative nature of the event. Because of so many distinguished speakers called to this podium, I wish to limit my address to a few brief sentences. In the first place, I take for myself Andrea Simoncini's words, to which I like to add my personal warm greetings to all the participants and the audience here for this conference. A very special thank you goes to the organizers, Andrea Pessina and Jennifer Celani on the Soprintendenza side, Alessandra De Luca, Lucrezia Palandri, and Giacomo Pailli, friends and colleagues in the comparative section of the Department of Legal Sciences on the university side. My deepest gratitude goes also to the prestigious institutions that, in various ways, generously supported the conference. Second, the subtitle of the conference reads, "A Dialogue with the United States." As a comparatist, a dialogic approach is inherent to my research method. Comparative research is necessarily a comparative effort which tends to bridge the gaps of understanding across different legal traditions. And today's conference is intensely comparative because not only favors the dialogue between a common law and a civil law system, but also connects different actors playing on the scene of cultural heritage law, scholars, private and public administrators, persons working in museums and foundations, practicing lawyers. The conference dialogue is specifically between Italy and the United States. The reasons for this duo, for choosing these two countries, are many. And Andrea Simoncini already mentioned some of these reasons that go far, are rooted in the history of this country. And I imagine that the explanation of the reasons and the importance of this choice will be part of today and tomorrow presentations and debates. But let me just remember a few things. For example, the fascination, the enchantment of Americans and Italians for their respective culture, a fascination that generated a privileged link between the US and Italy, and especially between the US and Firenze. And something else, the considerable amount of US involvement and investment in this country, in Italy. And what about the relevance of American scholarship on cultural heritage law? On this last point, I can't avoid mentioning a pioneer of the studies on cultural heritage law, John Harry Merriman, who inaugurated the first course on art and the law at Stanford back in 1970. And Merriman was, needless to say, a great comparative scholar. Now, if a relational attitude is a significant aspect of comparative legal theory in general, is even more so in my personal heritage. American mother, Italian father. I learned at a young age that dialogue between cultures is essential to make complex situations work efficiently. What is more complex than family relations? In the end, I hope that today's conference will facilitate the understanding between Italy and the United States in the complicated, intensely regulated, and ever-expanding field of cultural heritage law, and through a more accurate knowledge, contribute building a stronger and productive cooperation between the two shores of the Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vittoria Barsotti. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Rajini Gupta, U.S. Consul General of Florence, to deliver her welcome speech.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure for the consulate to be participating today. It's really an honor to have been invited, so thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation. And I actually feel a personal connection to this theme for a variety of different reasons. First of all, I have the privilege of working and living in a wonderfully gorgeous palazzo, such as this one, Palazzo Canevaro, which the consulate has been operating out of since after World War II, 1947. And the consulate is part of a very exclusive club of properties owned by the State Department. It's only one of 39 properties that has the honor of being listed on the Secretary of State's Register of Culturally Significant Properties. And thanks to this program, the Department of State provides professional stewardship, preservation, and most importantly, funding, so that Palazzo Canevaro can receive the attention that it deserves and that it needs. In the year and a half that I've been here, we have renovated the facade. We have redone the entire electrical wiring in the piano nobile. We are now working on stabilizing the structural integrity of my residence, the Consul General residence. And so it has been a constant stream of work, one big construction site since I've been here, but as a steward of this important property, it's a privilege and it's worth the effort. So the U.S. and Italy have a historic friendship and cultural connection that goes back hundreds of years. The consulate has had a presence here in Florence for over 200 years. And this cultural connection has blossomed thanks to the millions of personal ties, from the tourists embarking on their grand tour during the 19th century, to the artists who studied together at the Accademia, to the soldiers and partisans who fought side by side during World War II in Tuscany and Emilia-Romagna, and to the students who dropped everything to lend a hand during the flood of 1966. So I'd like to bring to our attention one particularly notable individual. Just last month, on May 22nd, we commemorated the 108th birthday of Frederick Hart, the Italian Renaissance scholar and art historian whose deep love for Italian art moved him to join the Monuments Men. And I'm sure all of you know who the Monuments Men are, but in a nutshell, the Monuments Men in Italy helped safeguard and recover some of the world's most treasured works of art during World War II. After the bombing of Florence, Frederick Hart composed an official report of the damage sustained by such notable Florentine institutions as the Uffizi, the Duomo, the Baptistry, and the churches of Santa Croce, Santo Spirito, and San Lorenzo. And in 1945, Hart helped locate and return to Florence hundreds of works of art to public collections, particularly the Uffizi and the Pitti Palace. These works that had been hidden by the Nazi regime in Alto Adige. For his efforts, Hart was made an honorary citizen of Florence, and he's buried in the Cimitero delle Ponte Sante at San Miniato a Monte in Florence, a real honor. Most recently, our cultural collaboration has taken the form of agreements. Agreements regarding the protection for Italian cultural property. Just before the pandemic, in October 2020, the United States and Italy signed a cultural property agreement which renewed a 20-year-long memorandum of understanding. This MOU, concerning the imposition of import restriction on categories of archaeological material representing the pre-classical, classical, and imperial Roman periods of Italy, is but one example of the United States' enduring relationship with Italy and collective efforts to combat cultural property trafficking and to preserve cultural heritage. I'm proud to say that one of the principal pillars of the State Department's mission is also to help safeguard cultural heritage around the world through the department's Cultural Heritage Center, which is a part of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. The Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs operates a number of global programs to safeguard the patrimony of other countries. And I have personally overseen cultural preservation work in Jordan, which was my last overseas assignment, in Petra and in the Roman ruins of Qais. Another recent development I was pleased to learn about on the Italian side is the recently inaugurated Museum of Rescued Art, designed to showcase Italy's efforts through patient diplomacy and court challenges to get valuable antiquities repatriated, often after decades in foreign museums or private collections. And this museum is currently exhibiting works never before seen in Italy. In sum, this is incredibly important work. What you're going to be discussing today is so important, and it's notable that both U.S. and Italian cultural preservation activities continued throughout the pandemic, obviously notwithstanding the challenges. So thank you very much for the initiative that you've taken today to continue a long tradition of cultural collaboration, connection, and preservation between the United States and Italy. I wish you all the best of luck and buon lavoro.
So thank you to Rajini Gupta. And now I would like to invite Polissena Brandolini Dada. Oh, okay, I was. Thank you. For the president of Friends of Florence.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Yes, I'm here on behalf of Simonetta Brandolini Dada, president of the Friends of Florence Foundation. Unfortunately, today she won't be able to join us as she's traveling, but of course, I'm delighted to share with you her welcome remarks. First and foremost, I would like to thank Director Andrea Simoncini, Sovrintendente Pessina, Professor De Luca, and of course also the General Counsel Regina Gupta and fellow speakers. Friends of Florence is a nonprofit foundation supported by individuals from around the world who are dedicated to preserving and enhancing the rich cultural heritage of Florence and Tuscany and conserving irreplaceable artistic and cultural treasures. Friends of Florence identifies significant projects spanning centuries in need of restoration, secures funding, and works in collaboration with local authorities to complete projects. Since its founding in 1998, the foundation has raised and donated more than 12 million euros for conservation of more than 400 projects in Florence and in the region of Tuscany. Friends of Florence works directly with various conservation laboratories to ensure that restoration is done at the highest level, working closely with the Sovrintendenza, the Comune of Florence, and other entities so that the many projects over the years are completed following an approved timeline and budget. Through its work, Friends of Florence creates opportunities for the study and appreciation of paintings, sculptures, architectural elements, places of worship, and collections at the Uffizi Gallery, the Accademia, the Baptistry, the Piazza della Signoria, dozens of other museums, churches, and public sites. A model of a high-impact, low-overhead philanthropy, Friends of Florence has become the primary source of funding for the city's conservators, a respected partner with museums and cultural authorities in Italy and the US, and a publisher and producer of publications, multimedia offerings, seminars, lectures, and cultural travel opportunities. Briefly, I would like to mention just a few of our projects from the last 24 years, including the marble statuary in the Loggia dell'Anzi in Florence's Piazza della Signoria, restored as our first project, including Giambologna's Rape of the Sabines. To celebrate its 10th anniversary, Friends of Florence restored the entire tribune in the Uffizi Gallery after having restored the Niobe Room and numerous ancient sculptures and artworks in the same museum. In 2016, 5 galleries were renovated, housing paintings by Botticelli and Pollaiolo. Giovanni Francesco Rustici's bronze sculptural grouping over the north doors of the Florence Baptistry, titled The Sermon of St. John the Baptist, were restored, and support was given to finalize the conservation of Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise. Ghirlandaio's monumental painting Last Supper at the Badia Passignano in Chianti was restored, and the refectory was reopened to the public. The entire cloister of the Vows, with frescoes by Andrea del Sarto, Pontormo, and other artists at the Church of the Santissima Annunziata, was restored during a 4-year conservation effort. In the same church, the restoration of Madonna del Soccorso of Giambologna's Christ Crucified and the 6 bronze reliefs with scenes from the Passion of Christ in the Giambologna Chapel and the entire chapel of San Luca has just been inaugurated. Since contributing to the restoration in 2004 of Michelangelo's David, The Prisoners, and numerous other artworks in the Accademia, Friends of Florence continues to support projects by Michelangelo, including the recent project for the Pietà in the Opera del Duomo Museum and 2 projects in Casa Buonarroti. And the list goes on and on. For the millennial anniversary of the founding of San Miniato, a Monte church overlooking the city, the main altar was completely restored in 2018, and the conservation of the entire chapel of the Cardinal of Portugal soon followed. We're now engaged in the restoration of the apse mosaics in this important church. Currently, the foundation has more than 20 restorations underway in the city of Florence, Volterra, Pistoia, and other localities in the region. Simonetta Brandolini D'Adda, president and co-founder of Friends of Florence and a resident of Florence since the 1970s, established the foundation as a way to share her love for the city, an extraordinary collection of art and architecture, and to address urgent needs for cultural preservation. The foundation is guided by an international board of trustees, a council of academic advisors, and the Council for the Future, which offers opportunities for engagement to young, emerging leaders in preservation and cultural realities. The importance of international cooperation in the world is ever so urgent today as we witness destruction of important historic and cultural sites and treasures in many parts of the globe. Laws must be passed to protect the unreplaceable artistic treasures that form part of our DNA for all of us. This testament to human achievements cannot be damaged or put in peril for our future generations. I hope that this conference will shine a light on a valid dialogue and understanding to achieve international cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Polissena Brandolini D'Adda. And I would like now to invite the Tenente Colonnello Giuseppe Marseglia, Commander of the Department of Carabinieri for the Protection of Cultural Heritage of Monza. Thank you.
I am honored to bring in such a prestigious location the greetings of General Roberto Riccardi, Commander-in-Chief of the Carabinieri for the Protection of Cultural Heritage, from now on TPC. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this important conference, and in particular the Department of Legal Sciences of the University of Florence and the Superintendents of Florence, Pistoia, and Prato, for the possibility offered in participating in a meeting where the focus will be laws aimed at safeguarding cultural heritage. An event which will also see the participation of our important American partners. We Carabinieri of the TPC are the living testimony of an Italian primacy. Italy was, in fact, the first country in the world to create, in 1969, a specialized police force department dedicated to the protection of cultural heritage. This achievement anticipated by a year the 1970 UNESCO directive that called on member states to do exactly the same thing. In our 53 years history, we Carabinieri TPC have created a complex and productive organization with 16 regional units, an operational department in Rome for international investigation, and, last but not least, the largest database in the world dedicated to illicitly stolen works of art. We are honored in saying that we are the children of an ancient and illustrious legal civilization, which, since Roman law, has acknowledged its intention for the protection of a cultural heritage, like the explicit reference made by the Decus that we found in the Codex Theodosianus at the end of the 4th century AD. These are our premises. This is the essential starting point for building a dialogue, which can establish the best support for a global understanding of the legal concept of protection and ensure, therefore, the best protection of an enormous and fragile cultural heritage that belongs to mankind. Thanks for your attention.
Many thanks to Tenente Colonnello Giuseppe Marseglia. And now, at the outset, I think we owe you an apology and an explanation. In our invitation, we touted this venue as a fully refurbished Villa Ruspoli. I mean, the venue of the conference is, it is not difficult to see. It is a beautiful building, but not fully refurbished. But the story behind this situation, and in particular that situation, is something, deserves being remembered, because it can be interesting. Once found had been allocated for the restoration of this villa, and the Department of Legal Sciences started asking for quotes for the repairs. And in particular, the tapestry was in need of an intervention, and two separate quotes were asked, one for restoration and the other for replacement. Needless to say, replacement was less expensive, and so probably this would have been our favorite choice, but the superintendency objected and required restoration. And of course, however, the initial estimate of the cost was really too huge. It was unfeasible, and it was necessary to look for alternative quotes. And obviously, this took extra time. That's why we are still here. Thankfully, a much less expensive solution has been found. And so I am glad to share with you that this is the last event that was going to take place with this situation. During the summer, the repairs will take place. And so here are explains the RIPS. So our small story is going to have a happy ending, and we are very glad of this. But the reason why I'm telling it now is that this story seems to us all the perfect example to start delving deep into the Italian law of cultural heritage, a kind of case study highlighting the main competing interests and needs that characterize this field: preservation and promotion, valorization, cultural and historical interest, but also economic viability. So everything is in there. And so here we come to the topic of our conference, the Italian law of cultural heritage, a dialogue with the United States. In order to explain what we are trying to achieve through this conference, our purpose, I think that the best perspective is the metaphor of dialogue that my colleagues immediately picked. The idea of the conference actually was born out of some dialogues, of some conversations between the members of the organizing committee. And during these conversations, these dialogues, we all realized that there was a difficulty for the foreign public to understand, and sometimes even before that, to be aware of the complex, all-encompassing rules governing cultural heritage in the Italian legal system. And so, notwithstanding the interest, the fascination, the love that so many foreign people and institutions, and first of all Americans, have for our cultural heritage, on the other hand, we do see a kind of lack of awareness and of understanding. And this lack exists at two different levels, although connected, they are different. On a broader level, it affects the vision, the philosophy underpinning the Italian law of cultural heritage. I mean, I could say the Italian culture of cultural heritage. On a more tangible level, it refers to the very existence and the contents of all the regulation affecting the activities involving our inestimable artistic treasures, be it the investment in some historic real estate, or the purchase of antiques, or the digitization of artworks or cultural objects. And during these conversations, we realized that these difficulties share a common root, and this root is, at least in part, linguistic. What we realize is that the literature on the Italian law of cultural heritage in English is scarce. Although English is today lingua franca, although there is this great interest by English-speaking people, the literature is missing. And therefore, the ambitious aim of this conference is to take at least a first step towards bridging this gap, towards filling the gap in legal scholarship by discussing and then publishing a volume presenting the Italian law of cultural heritage in English. We are aware that this is not an easy task. Partly because of the difficulty of translating into English the unique concepts, notions of our law of cultural heritage. And we had a first-hand experience of these difficulties in the preparation of the conference, starting with the very basic notions of tutela and valorizzazione that are at the heart of the first and second panel tomorrow. How do we translate them? We chose, we make a choice, but I mean, we are open to discuss it today. Therefore, for the first session tomorrow, we choose public and private in the promotion of cultural heritage. So promotion was our choice for valorizzazione, but valorization could be an option and is an option. Then, for the second panel, we choose protection for tutela and circulation of cultural heritage. But also the choice of the title of the third panel was not straightforward. Digitalization of cultural heritage between preservation and promotion, or maybe digitization. This was the alternative option. This awareness led us, and in particular, we must thank Jennifer Celani, who had the idea and who promoted and implemented this idea to produce a short glossary that was circulated among us, first of all, and then also it was shared with our speakers. It is a first draft. We think it could be useful, and we aim to publish the final version as a kind of appendix to the proceedings of this conference. Any suggestion is more than welcomed on this draft. So, and here I must admit that the linguistic aspect is the first one that attracted my attention when the idea of this conference was discussed among us. I am not an expert in the law of cultural heritage, but I am a comparatist, and legal translation is a field where legal comparison can bring a distinctive contribution. Actually, and here I'm quoting, the relationship between law and language is implicitly and explicitly at the core of comparative law research. And I am quoting from the editorial of the first issue of a new law journal devoted to comparative law and language. There's a whole field to be developed. It was published this year. I think it would be a useful tool. Thanks in particular to the scholarship of Rodolfo Sacco, who died last March, one of the father of comparison, whose views were summarized in English in the seminar article published 1991 on the American Journal of Comparative Law, Legal Formats, a Dynamic Approach to Comparative Law. Legal translation has now acquired the dignity of an autonomous discipline, traductology. A new word was found for this discipline. So, from my perspective, this conference offers a unique opportunity to engage with all the problems of legal translation in action. Then, the metaphor of dialogue well represents also the methodological approach of the conference. The multifaceted topic of law of cultural heritage can only be understood and explained by adopting a multidisciplinary approach and by establishing a dialogue between different disciplines, but also different types of expertise. So, theoretical and practical, public and private. This is the criterion that guided us when we imagined the framework of the conference that aims to be an attempt to bring together scholars, and not just legal scholars, with experts, functionaries from the ministry, directors of state and private museums and foundations, to address the main issues of the debate on cultural heritage in an interactive dialogue with the United States. This reference brings me to highlight two additional points. First of all, we have identified the American public as our privileged audience, as the subtitles clearly indicates, due not just to the scale of US involvement and investments, because we heard very significant amounts of investment in this field, but also for the relevance of American scholarship on cultural heritage. I can just mention one name. We cannot deal with this topic without mentioning John Henry Merriman. He was a great comparatist. The civil law tradition is a classic volume. He had very close ties with Italy and with Italian legal system. I mean, Historyology, the Italian-style articles published in the mid-60s on the Italian legal system are still a very useful reading. And I mean, these are the basis for a subsequent volume that he published with Mauro Cappelletti and Joseph Perillo on the Italian legal system in 1967. So, but the point is that he was also the founder of the field art law. We can call him the founder of this field with his course that was already mentioned by Vittoria, and this course gave rise to that seminal volume, which is the leading text on art law, law, ethics, and the visual arts. So it is a fundamental point of reference for us. And probably also the fact that we are in Florence was not unrelated to the choice of this American perspective, because there is a privileged relationship between Florence and Tuscany as a whole and the United States, as the very existence of Friends of Florence shows. No other Italian city has a Friends of. This does not mean, however, that the conference will offer a kind of parallel presentation of the Italian and US legal system on the law of cultural heritage, as the recourse to the dialogue metaphor could suggest. Rather, what we would like to do is to set in the stage for the dialogue by offering a portrayal in English of the multifaceted topic of the Italian law of cultural heritage that always includes a foreign perspective. Very often it would be the American perspective, but not only the American one. So our point of view is still the Italian law of cultural heritage. And the publishing of the proceedings of the conference is our next natural step. But as I said before, but this is not, we do not consider it the final step of our project. Rather, we hope that this conference and the publication that will follow will be, the starting point for a future dialogue in English on the Italian law of cultural heritage and on the many topics that during this conference will only be touched upon but not fully developed. To conclude, as a co-chair, I would like to express my warmest thanks, first of all, to my fellow members of the committee, because without their passion and expertise, nothing would have been achieved. Then to all those who supported us, and special thanks go to the Department of Legal Sciences, of course, for the general support, and in particular to Professor Andrea Simoncini, who managed to be here, notwithstanding other commitments, to address the audience personally, and to Professor Chiara Favilli, who's not here, but was fundamental, not just because she oversaw the restoration, but she was of great help during all the organization of the conference, and then the many other institutions that supported us with generosity and enthusiasm. So Friends of Florence, University of Notre Dame Law School, Salvatore Ferragamo, Alta Toscana Innova, MPM Avvocati, and Generali Agenzia di Firenze. Last but not least, I would like to thank the institutions that offer their patronage as a kind of support for our appreciation for our project. The Comune di Firenze, but also CIRD, CIRD, la Società Italiana per la Ricerca in Diritto Comparato, and the Italian hub of ELI, the European Law Institute. Thank you.
Few words about the wall. Are you sure it isn't a Lucio Fontana artwork? Ladies and gentlemen, authorities, dear Consul General of the United States, dear colleagues and friends, I would give my personal welcome in our city to all the participants of this conference. I am an archaeologist and from 2016, director of the Florentine Superintendence, the state office for the protection of the cultural heritage in this area. I would like to thank the Florence University, especially the Department of Scienze Giuridiche, Professor Alessandra De Luca, and Jennifer Celani from my office for the proposal to organize this conference I received some months ago. Secondly, I would like to apologize with all for my bad English. So I will speak slowly, and I hope that Jennifer helped me for a better understanding. And I invite other speakers, please speak slowly and clearly. Which are the aims of this conference? The starting point is the Italian law for the protection of the cultural heritage, the Code. It constitutes a very firm system, and it is often used as a paradigm for other countries, not only in Europe. Without any doubt, our fathers created about a century ago a strong system for the protection of the national masterpieces and the archaeological treasures and sites. But already before, in medieval times, the Italian comuni, as we call the independent city-states, and the regional kingdoms had forbidden the exportation of art pieces. We are proud of this system, but it's for us a hard work. And we know that the Italian Code for Cultural Heritage is not easy to understand, also for the Italian people. And sometimes, reading some judgments of the court, we have the feeling that also for the judge is not clear. Specific competencies are requested and cultural awareness to understand how wide could be our idea of heritage, and that this category is an open one and could change and increase day by day. And in addition, the world is changing fast. We have to face the globalization and the appearance of digital things in the art market, the non-fungible token, that a few years ago were completely unknown, the problem of the reuse of ancient buildings, the theme of the abandonment of churches, and consequently, the problem of the extremely rich artistic heritage that they contain. Second point, the cultural heritage. Of course, through the centuries, the Italian notion of cultural heritage has been enlarged and improved. Now, it also consists of landscape, what we call beni paesaggistici, in addition to archaeology, historical sites and buildings, oral traditions, immaterial goods, fossils, photos, negatives, car, scientific instruments, and so on. Everything is older than 70 years and could be considered useful for the reconstruction of the national history or for the cultural identity of the local communities. And our idea of cultural heritage consists not only of things, but also of relations between objects. For example, a group of objects without any relevance become important as a collection, or also relations between objects and places. Fundamental for us are the significance of the original context and the importance of the strong links that have been generated during the ages between the objects and the places, the territories, the local communities. About this last point, we are creating new legal duties, as for example, what we call vincolo pertinenziale, a very strong protective restriction that ties an object to a place or to a territory from where they cannot be separated or removed. It is a category accepted now from the recent jurisprudence, but there is no mention of it in the code. And we have some recent sentences from the law court in Florence, and if you are interested, I give the material to the organizer to put on the site. In the United States, cultural heritage is still mainly conceived as art objects or true masterpieces. In Italy, art object is only one of the different categories that constitute cultural heritage. This difference is really important. Beauty and economical value are not the unique parameters. What is important for us is the historical value. One simple example to understand, maybe a stupid one, but it's clear. A potsherd or a coin of a Roman period has no economical value, but if I found it during an archaeological excavation in USA, I can suppose that the Romans arrived in America many centuries before Columbus. This is the importance of the context, where we found the object. This is one of the reasons why all the archaeological objects are protected by the Italian law. These differences between the American and the Italian viewpoints still exist and are useful to understand why, in the memorandum on the limited importation of archaeological objects from Italy in USA, the consul reminded a few minutes ago, signed between our country for the first time in 2001 and recently renewed in 2020, the archaeological objects under protection are only the things dated from 9th century before Christ to 4th century after Christ. So excluding prehistory, we don't know why, Bronze Age, and of course, paleontology. The problem of circulation. We are now part of the European Union and of a larger international community and market, and we have also to face the heavy circulations of people and goods. Another new problem, previously unknown because of the size it has taken on, is the illicit trafficking of stolen objects. For a long time, it was essentially an Italian problem. During the peak of illegal exportation, Italy lost 12,000 artifacts per year in the early 80s. It is the equivalent of losing a museum full of artifacts and antiquities per year. Now this number decreased less than 1,000. But due to the recent wars, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, and the use of this trafficking from the terroristic groups and mafia to find economic resources, this phenomenon is now impressive. To know the market value of looted artifacts is impossible, but at the end of last century, it was between $6 and $10 billion. This statistic puts the legal antiquities market in third place, behind narcotics and illegal art trading, for the most profit to be made on the black market. Finally, for this and other reasons, we think that it is important a dialogue between our countries and specialists for a better understanding of Italian law, to explain the historical formation of the Italian Code of Cultural Heritage, the role we ascribe to the heritage for the development of a nation, and not only as economic value. A roundtable and 3 panels will be devoted to these topics. We know that one day and a half are not sufficient to fully address this issue, but we hope that this conference will be only the first of a long series, as Alessandro told a few minutes ago. Thank you for your attention.
Now we invite Jennifer Celani and Cristina Cidini to take their place.
Hai da proiettare, Cristina? Bene, bene. Sì, sì, sì.
Good afternoon, everybody. The history of cultural heritage protection on present-day Italian soil goes back a variable number of centuries, depending on when one decides it originated, either during the Roman Empire or the Middle Ages over free communes, or even in the Renaissance. In any case, it is a long path, which has generated numerous norms and measures up to the present day. They reveal the socially widespread awareness of the high quality of a man-made environment, both urban and rural, to the tangible present of arts and knowledge inherited from the antiquity are added from generation to generation the countless works of contemporaries, product of their ingenuity and creativity. It is thanks to this awareness, at times vividly perceived, at times relegated to the margins, yet always present, that protective action is regulated by measures that take on diverse legal configurations over time, but having their foundation in the constant and reiterated principles of the so-called tutela. It has already been mentioned. A foreword on the primary meaning of the Italian word tutela might be useful. It derives from the Latin word tutela, which in turn derives from tutus, past participle of the verb tueri, to protect, to defend. As with any term deeply rooted in the past, it is useful to start with the first official vocabulary of the Italian language established by the Accademici della Crusca in 1612. Quote, properly, it is the protection of the pupil for whomever has the guardianship of said pupil, end quote, where pupil stands for minor. This is the definition that will go unchanged for 1 century. Today's primary meaning of tutela in the Treccani vocabulary is, quote, a legal establishment by which a person appointed by the custody judge assumes the protection and representation of a minor, an incapacitated or ineligible person in the manner established by law, end quote. The second definition states, quote, defense, safeguarding, protection of a right or a material or moral good and its maintenance and regular exercise and enjoyment by not only an individual, but also by a community, end quote. Although more directly expressed in the legal terms of the second meaning, relating to the entitlement of a right to or an enjoyment of a material good, the concept of protection of cultural heritage is inherent in the first meaning, that assigns to responsible figures the protection and defense of a fragile subject. In this case, we are not dealing with human beings, but with inanimate entities. They deserve that they be given expression and heed to those rights that are their own, but which they are unable to enforce independently. Therefore, we are referring to cultural heritage and, by the same token, natural and landscape heritage. I remember greeting with great joy the measures taken for the Wanganui River in New Zealand in 2017, and shortly thereafter for the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India, which were granted a legal personality protected by a legal representative. In the specific bibliography on the protection laws, which already includes a very large and growing number of entries, the contributions made by leaders and scholars of the field, such as Andrea Emiliani, Antonio Paolucci, and Salvatore Settis, remain as landmarks. It is precisely to Settis, an archaeologist by training and therefore immersed in the culture of the ancient world, that we owe some valuable indications on how far back the idea of tutela can go, in the forms in which it can be traced down to measures imposed during the Roman Empire, the so-called legatum ad patriam, which entered Italian law with the formula dicatio ad patrem, coined only 100 years ago. This premise is not unnecessary, since many of the principles on which the Italian legal system has been founded through the centuries, and is still founded today, can be traced to Roman law over the imperial age. According to the digest or Pandex of Justinian, 533 Anno Domini, on the basis of a principle of common good for publica utilitas, whatever was placed by private individuals in public place, for example, the facade of a building or a statue, fell at least in part under legal status of res populi Romani, resulting in the establishment of the preeminence of public interest over the property rights of individual citizens, although recognized as such. And this is precisely the ethical and legal framework for every subsequent norm, with a constant and repeated reference to two inspiring principles. The first being the protection of the extant, that is, the preservation of the dignity and beauty of places and things, as well of the historical memories that they have handed down. The second inspiring principle is preserving movable objects in the territories to which they belong, through the regulation of legal transfer and restitutions in case of illegal removal. With regard to preservation of public decorum and the safeguarding of historical vestiges, the ordinances of medieval cities can offer good examples. When it comes to protecting the values of a community, and not only in artistic and historical terms, but also in a broader civic and ethical sense, the general interest has priority over that of the individual. Let's look at the 12th century. In 1162, the Roman Senate decreed the death penalty for anyone who damaged Trajan's column, with the following beautiful admonition, quote, that the column never be damaged or demolished, but to remain as it is for all eternity, intact and unaltered until the end of the world, end quote. At the height of the Renaissance, the letter to Leo X, written in Rome in 1519 by Raphael and Baldassare Castiglione, offers us a full and complete expression of the realization that there was a need to protect existing objects, especially those of antiquity. Here, Raphael, the greatest painter and architect of Renaissance Rome, implores the Pope to stop the destruction of ancient relics in bronze and marble for utilitarian purposes. If the humanists' oft-voiced complaints had been in vain, that letter found a hearing. Leo X established a supervisor authority, entrusting the task to Raphael himself as the forebearer of today's superintendents. As for the second guiding principle of the legislation, that is the preservation of movable heritage in its territory of origin, the main instrument was export control and possibly bans for objects having a relevance in local history, and after the unification of Italy in 1861, in national history. Attempts were thus made to curb the impoverishment of the cultural treasures stratified in the Italian peninsula, generally, however, with little success, as evidenced by the massive presence of antiquities and art objects that left Italy to refurbish museums and collections worldwide. The first measure on exportation was promulgated in Florence in 1602, thanks to the Grand Duke Ferdinando I de' Medici. He entrusted the members of the Accademia del Disegno, the first fine arts academy in Europe, to draw up a list of painters whose work were absolutely forbidden to be moved from one place to another, even more so, to be exported, without the license of the head of the Accademia. This position, now called president, I am presently honored to hold. 18 artists were on the list, with Michelangelo in the first place, then Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, and others of all nations. Sadly to say, the founder of the Accademia, Giorgio Vasari, was not in the list. When it comes to the export bans, however, it is in Rome that the most sensational episode is recorded. In brief, in 1728, Cardinal Alessandro Albani, the Pope's nephew, sold 30 statues of his to the King of Poland and managed to export them by violating the bans. But when he tried to sell antiquities to the British, his brother, Cardinal Annibale, issued an edict, namely the Albani Edict of 1733, that blocked their exportation. The Albani Edict refers to, quote, the great advantage of public and private good, end quote, the ancient notion of utilitas. The collection was immediately purchased by Pope Clement XII and became the nucleus of the Capitoline Museum, the first public museum in Europe. Thus, the entire legislation prior to and after the unity of Italy shall develop in compliance of these two basic principles, to protect and to keep in place. And it should be added that more and more in tune with the philosophical and ethical approach of the Age of Enlightenment, the concept of knowledge, groundwork for any action of protection, came to the fore. That is, acquire an idea, as far as possible, of the consistency of the heritage through inventories and catalogues. This was the method systematically implemented by the Venetian Republic, which in 1773 appointed art historian Abbot Anton Maria Zanetti as inspector. To prevent clandestine exports and illegal sales, Zanetti drew up a catalogue of all paintings in churches and public buildings, the first with such a wide scope. Meanwhile, in Venice, shortly after Canaletto's death, his paintings, purchased by gentlemen on the Grand Tour, were taking the most diverse routes in Europe, so that very few remained in Italy. A short survey of the most relevant provisions in the history of protection will show that the majority were enacted or reinforced in order to prevent serious risks or in response to traumatic events. Let's take a quick look at the cases of Florence, Naples, and Rome. In Florence, the Medici dynasty was dying out, with the last Grand Duke Gian Gastone in 1737. The immense cultural patrimony put together over 3 centuries of collecting had become state-owned over time and now risked dispersion at the hands of the legitimate successors, the Lothringen. But the last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa, the Electress Palatine, a wise and well-advised woman, managed to prevent it. In the years leading up to the transfer of the throne, she commissioned records and inventories so as to leave, so to speak, a snapshot of the consistency of the estates. Above all, however, she had the great merit of signing an effective legal act with her successor, an agreement known as the Patto di Famiglia, thanks to which all the objects belonging to the state, that is, quote, galleries, painting, statues, library, jewels, and other precious things, quote, end quote, were bound to remain in their proper places and thus saved from dispersion. That legacy passed, yes, to the Lothringen, thus to the state and not to the city of Florence. But, quote, on the express condition that this be for the ornament of the state, for the utility of the public, and to attract the curiosity of foreigners, nothing of which shall be transported and lifted out of the capital and state of the Grand Duchy, end quote. This is one of the most formidable examples of a direct protection provision that was ever enacted. Here, the purpose of heritage, its very raison d'être, is expressed in terms both clear and elegant: the beauty of the state, the education of the people, the attraction to the outsiders, those whom we now call tourists. In the kingdom of the Sicilies, near Naples, it was the rediscovery of ancient cities of Herculaneum and then Pompeii that inspired measures to protect archaeological heritage. In addition to fascinating both scholars and researchers, in fact, the archaeological discoveries in the Vesuvian cities immediately aroused the interest of thieves, antiquity traffickers, and unscrupulous collectors. King Charles of Bourbon then issued an initial measure in 1755, which sanctioned a ban on the export of objects important, quote, for excellence of work, artifice, or of other rarity, end quote. This protective legislation, although expanded and renewed, was destined to succeed to an unfortunately very limited extent. The Age of Enlightenment, by inventing modern historiography, had extolled the value of cultural heritage not only and not so much as a repository of beauty, but also, and above all, as an archive of collective memories and warrantor of the identity of civilizations. However, that century was destined to close with a tremendous cataclysm, which disrupted the stratification of artistic heritage in Italian and European countries, with the violence of a tsunami, scattering precious vestiges everywhere. For almost 20 years, from 1797 to 1815, the military occupation of the French army under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte proceeded hand in hand with the despoliation of sacred and profane, public and private buildings in Italy, in order to concentrate the art treasures of the conquered territories in the Louvre Museum in a universal perspective. Napoleon, aided by Louvre director Vivant Denon, had begun his campaigns with very specific orders, expressed by the Revolutionary Executive Directory in 1796 as follows. It is a long quotation, but it deserves it. Quote, "Citizen General, the Executive Directory is convinced that for you the glory of the fine arts and that of the army under your orders are inseparable. Italy owes to the art the greater part of its wealth and fame. But the time has come to transfer it to France, to consolidate and beautify the kingdom of liberty. The National Museum must enclose all the most celebrated artistic monuments, and you will not fail to enrich it with those which it expects from the present conquest of the army of Italy and from those which the future holds in store for it, by adding to the splendor of military triumph the consoling and beneficial enchantment of art. The Executive Directory therefore exhorts you to seek out, assemble, and have brought to Paris all the most precious objects of this kind," end quote. It's impressive to read it now. To no avail, in the same year, for the prison where he was held, French archaeologist Antoine Quatremer de Quincy contested those spoliations in letters to Miranda, in which he proclaimed the value of the original context of any work of antiquity or art. Hard hit by the Treaty of Tolentino, which deprived Rome of dozens of masterpieces, Pope Pius VII raised his defenses with the famous chirograph, or document handwritten in 1802, surely inspired by the celebrated artist and Inspector General of Fine Arts Antonio Canova. It was precisely thanks to Canova's action and with the support of the British that the Italian states managed to regain part of their heritage during the Restoration. But things did not really get back on track. In Italy, the Pinacoteca di Brera in Milan is a glaring example where masterpieces from other areas, particularly the Marche and Umbria, remained. In France, the Louvre returned only part of Italian works, inventorying those retained under the ambiguous diction Dépôt d'Italie. Pius VII chirograph was an articulate measure. It established the basis of protection, such as the need to catalogue all heritage. Furthermore, the following is: applying state protection duties on privately owned works, the right of preemption in the case of buying and selling, regulating exportation, declaring the intrinsic value of famous collections housed by Roman nobility, which anticipate the 20th century concept of notifica d'insieme. In other words, that portions of a collection cannot be removed or sold. And the appointment of expert and responsible professional figures. In 1820, a few years after the rather unsuccessful conclusion of the Napoleonic affair, the Papal State endowed itself with a regulation implementing the chirograph, which, by reason of the signee of the paper, is called the Pacca Edict. In the introductory lines, the concept of preserving, safeguarding, and promoting the attractive and educational potential of cultural heritage, which run through the Italian attitudes towards it, are reaffirmed. If I have insisted on the historical roots of the cultural protection, it is in order to share the awareness that this specific sensitivity to cultural heritage is part of a century-old legacy, inseparable from the Italian identity, which is incumbent upon us to share with those who today live here and come from other contexts, countries, and experiences. The unification of Italy represented a setback in the production of norms on protection, partly because of the little interest of the Savoy monarchy in this matter. The norms of the pre-unitary states were by then a weak instrument against the tumultuous transformations of historical centers and the wild export of works of antiquity and art, favored by the suppression of religious institutions and the scattering of the great family collections. Some ministers proposed bills, but they were never enacted or were inadequate, such as Law number 185 of 1902. Thus, it was not until more than 40 years after the unification of Italy that the first real national law of protection saw the light of day. It was the Rosà di Lava Law, number 364 of June 10, 1909, for antiquities and fine art, to which a great art historian and official such as Corrado Ricci had collaborated. Interestingly enough, the concept of cultural heritage was being expanded, defined as, quote, movable and immovable property endowed with historical, archaeological, paleontological, and artistic interest, end quote. Superintendencies were established as peripheral offices of the state for control over the territory. But a pivotal year for the consolidation and protection legislation in Italy was 1939, in the fascist era. Under the signature of Minister Giuseppe Bottai and under the guidance of art historians of the level of Roberto Longhi and Giulio Carlo Argan, no less than 2 laws on protection were enacted. Number 1089, which dealt with the protection of things of historic and artistic interest, and number 1497, which dealt instead with natural beauty. The concept of cultural heritage was further expanded to include everything that had relevance to the nation's history and which the public had a right to enjoy. Also in that year, the Central Institute for Restoration was founded in Rome, and other important central structures of the Ministry of Public Education we recall it was named, were established or reorganized. It was necessary to wait until 1975 to have a Ministry of Cultural Heritage, thanks to Giovanni Spadolini. And to conclude, the long history of protection on Italian soil, which I have tried to outline as briefly as possible, is like a majestic castle to which every government, every authority, in every time has brought its constructive contribution, whether this be a cornerstone or a supporting pillar, or even just a pebble. Against the resilience of the immense cultural heritage created in Italy through the millennia have conspired the traumatic events I have described, but also 2 world wars, speculative buildings, earthquakes, floods, and damages to the environment, all fearsome allies of that great destroyer that is time. How can we be surprised then if centuries of aspiration to retain and hand down a heritage undermined by constant risks have produced a system of laws based on controls and prohibitions? How to ask the legislature to depart from the path so deeply and tenaciously charted by its predecessors to embrace an unpredictable liberalism with unforeseeable consequences? Much has been lost. But if what remains is still so conspicuous as to be fundamental to culture and attractive on a worldwide scale, it is thanks to the laws of protection, which have prevented further destruction and dispersion. To combine the demands for preservation and safeguarding with the pressures of the last century, when the demand for the sharing and enjoyment of cultural heritage became more strongly felt within civil society, this is the new frontier of challenges legislators must face. In 1999, Consolidation Act, the Cultural Heritage Code, and more recent legislation have been part of the answer. It is now up to Jennifer Celani, a capable state functionary and a great friend whom I am especially grateful to carry us with a few words from her perspective on how the law is applied in practical terms today. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christina. I am going to share my hopefully short speech with you by projecting it on slides. Thank you. Well, the next step after the Bottai laws in 1939, whose powerful measures are still valid today, was to face the responsibility described in Article 9 of the Constitution that was drafted in 1947-1948, when Italy became a unified republic after World War II. And as we all know, the first 12 articles of that document lay the fundamental principles of the nation, and in regard to the cultural treasures of the country, the constitutional fathers thus wrote in a few simple words: the Republic promotes the development of culture and scientific and technical research. It protects the nation's landscape and its historic and artistic heritage. It has been shortly implemented this year. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Besides reinforcing a sense of national unity that has been expressed through the identification and protection of heritage, the state became responsible for all those actions aimed at adding value to that heritage by promoting its potential. So a series of laws continued to follow until the so-called Testo Unico came into force in 1999, a sort of consolidated act. This, in turn, laid the way for the present law of cultural heritage, the code that we have been familiarly using today. That legislative decree that came out in 2004 and that we apply today. The code is the fruit of a house cleaning job the government was delegated to do, as there was confusion and overlaying of responsibilities between the state, the regions, and local authorities prior to this. Next slide. I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you. It became clear that the country needed to have a single legal instrument for implementing protection and thus attaining to the ultimate goal of cultural heritage, namely the public enjoyment, that utilitas that we heard, or use of those spiritual and non-spiritual assets that the country had at hand. In other words, if the nation's heritage is well protected and promoted, this leads to benefits for the population. Since 2004, subsequent integrations and modifications have been and continue to be made to the code that, however, do not change the basic principles of its articles, but go more into detail of its applicability. One was the reform of the ministry promoted by Dario Franceschini in 2014, which, for example, separated promotion from protection. An example is the removal of the duties of promotion of all state collections from those of the Soprintendenze. For example, the Uffizi was directed by a functionary under the superintendent of Florence, and Dr. Accidini was the last to hold this office as superintendent. The reform also fused, and this was very good for us, the three separate soprintendenze. There was an archaeological, a landscape and architectural soprintendenza, and an art historical into one single branch office of the ministry in order to facilitate procedures that could require expertise in all three branches. I am also showing you a few pertaining images to give you an idea of the field work that we do every day. The job of each category of functionary, officer, or employee, as you wish to use the word, architect, art historian, archaeologist, restorer, sometimes anthropologist when we can, yes, is basically twofold. I'm sorry? Slide. Yes, I'm sorry. Is twofold, thank you. On the one hand, thanks to scholarship and expertise, identify heritage and judge with foresight whether it needs a form of protection in order to be passed on to future generations. On the other, go by the book, seeing to it that all protection rules are correctly conducted, communicated properly, well administered, and that there is no violation of property rights. This entails a lot of paperwork, and the paperwork holds legal value, thanks to a protocol system, now digitally accessible and standardized nationally, that registers steps taken in resolving procedures. Take, for example, the art historians working for a soprintendenza. They can be called curators in the American sense of the word, but they haven't got one part of a museum collection to look after, but rather must oversee everything that is not in a state-run museum and yet for whose protection the state is responsible. That open-air museum art historian and past minister Antonio Paolucci so aptly coined, familiarly referring to il territorio. And what is it? What is it? What do we do every day? Well, as an art historian, artworks in civic and diocesan museums, artworks and decorative cycles in churches and civic museums like Santa Croce or Palazzo Vecchio, private collections which have been listed as heritage, for example, from the ancient noble or aristocratic families that Christina spoke about, bank foundations, decorative works and painted cycles in private residences that have been listed as heritage, for example, Palazzo Corsini or the residence of our Consul General, tabernacles, cemeteries, fountains, garden, open-air statuary in public places or registered private places, and objects of ethnographic value when no anthropologist is on the staff. Here are some of the daily procedures of a soprintendenza in order to protect heritage and maintain the dignity that we heard about. And these are the things that we perform on a daily basis. Authorize excavations and restoration work and follow up with planned inspections. Perform conservation surveys for privately owned works that are listed. Authorize artworks on loan for exhibitions and follow the packing and the exhibition mounting of those artworks. Authorize reproductions, material, photographic, televised, digital, and the use of objects and places. Verify public property that is by virtue of age and importance, ope legis, that is potentially cultural heritage, or declare an object owned privately worthy of protection. And Italy's cultural heritage grows day by day. A good example is offered by the Franchi Stadium, designed by Pierluigi Nervi in 1931, that you see a picture of. Decreed heritage just a year ago. Perform landscape protection activities. Authorize toponymy. Conduct inventories and cataloging. Join circulation committees for permits to check illicit trafficking or promote state preempted acquisitions. Join meetings for crises and disaster units, earthquakes, floods. Join meetings for the UNESCO Intangible Heritage Management Plans. Be accountable through monitoring, public presentations, publishing, and so on. In the next slide, this is a list, and as you can see, this is the lion's share, okay? There are about 180 articles in the code. Well, let's say on a daily basis, there are over 40 different types of procedures that we work on daily. And these consist in documents that carry reference to the law and have protocol numbers. And as you can see, there is tutela paesaggistica, landscapes, architecture, landscapes and architecture combined, movable goods of all sorts, and of course the circulation office. So this gives you an idea of the amount of work that is handled, and Dr. Pessina has to sign each of these documents before they are issued. In the next slide, for those of you who are not familiar with the law, it is structured, as I said, into, there are 180 articles structured into 5 parts. Daily duties, those that we just saw on the list, that take the lion's share, mostly concern Part 2, Articles 9 bis through 140. And these have to be cited in our legal documents, which deal with the definition of movable and unmovable cultural heritage, the procedures to create new protection duties, and norms that regulate conservation and use. And Part 3, pertaining to that landscape that we heard Cristina Cidini mention. Landscape must be protected using mutual forms of agreement thanks to constitutional laws that give power to the region in this particular field. Landscape is now seen from an interdisciplinary point of view where human activity, vernacular architecture, or rural movable goods are now entering into its definition, more in line with the UNESCO idea of a landscape as a natural place marked by the presence of man. But it has also been modified, as mentioned to you, to include environment, biodiversity, and renewable energy sources. There are about approximately 16,000 employees, I hope my numbers are correct, working for the ministry on a nationwide basis today, and this includes staff running state-owned museums. Each of today's 43 soprintendenze has geographic jurisdiction, and employees are assigned procedures on the basis of the nature of the cultural object, where it is located and the type of procedures necessary. And employees travel a lot on a daily basis in order to be able to conduct regular on-site inspections. There's a picture of the huge Gonfienti excavation, Etruscan excavation in Prato. One must add that for those who handle protection of manuscripts, rare books, and archival material, work under one of the 17 Soprintendenze Archivistiche e Bibliografiche, and the workload is more or less the same. In brief, we may assert that the 2004 Code, or Law of Cultural Heritage, has indeed brought to fruition those century-old aspirations we have just heard described so magisterially. But the law is now faced with new challenges. We heard Dr. Pessina mention this, the evaluation, and Cristina Cidini too, the evaluation of the impact of renewable energy sources on landscape after the February 8th, 2022 modification. New free circulation rules for works of art under the threshold of 70 years of age and with a declared value on the part of the owner and the art dealer under 13,500 euros. Globalization, or touristification, and its impact on local populations of historic centers and the consequential loss of identity and traditions. And last but not least, dematerialization, that digitization of physical records whose tie with protection and potential loss risks are being underestimated. My last is just a very personal conclusion. I hope you enjoy it. But last but not least, we must reflect on the meaning, Alessandra, of the words used today behind the laws of tutela, or protection, words that lead to concrete visual imagery like vincolo, chains, as those of St. Peter in Vincoli, the church that houses Michelangelo's Moses, when commonly referring to a registered or listed unmovable object, or paesaggio, landscape, whose root is in paese, indicating township and people rather than land. Bene, the object with a common root in buono, or good. Also, notificare, to list a private work of art, with a term underlining the process of becoming public the instant it is made known. And valorizzare, to promote heritage by using an economic term based on the word value. These and more reveal the semantic richness of the law and its need to be a harbinger of future dialectics and development. Thanks for your attention. And now the round table is, no? Oh, excuse me.
Since we were very good to be right on time, we are 10 minutes ahead of schedule, so I propose we take a 10 minutes break.
Yay!
Some water, and you can just walk a little bit, refreshment. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Bravo. quando mi inizio.
Il microfono? Vai, vai tranquillo. Sì, sì,
So Filippo Valguarnera sadly cannot join us today due to serious family issues, so he won't be here. The round table is going to be a discussion among our speakers on 5 key themes. And each speaker will delve deep into a specific topic for about 10 minutes, and then there will be time for the others to make observation, comments on that topic, and once the discussion is over, we move on to the next topic. As last, and so each theme will be about 20 to 25 minutes. As last, we will try to cover also Filippo's topic, and we will make some remarks from his abstract, and then the speakers will make comments, and then at that point, if we still have time, it will be a good moment to open up the discussion to the audience and collect some questions and comments, observations. I would pass on to Giacomo to introduce our first speaker and our first topic.
So thank you very much, Lucrezia, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to see 1 year of work materialized in 1 day and a half. And we are really proud of what we achieved, and that your participation was so enthusiastic. So thank you very much. Our first topic, our first question that we want our participants to address and discuss is, what is cultural heritage? How we define cultural heritage? And who better than Paola D'Agostino, who's the director of Museo del Bargello, could address this issue. So Paola, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thanks to the organizer of this extraordinary conference. I am very grateful for the invitation. I'm grateful to Jennifer Celani first, who approached me since we worked together a few years ago, to Andrea Persina, who is a constant person I dialogue with, as you will hear later on, and the colleagues of the University of Florence whom I did not know, but I hope to get to know better, because it seems that they interpreted a growing wish of people who work in the field of administration, management, and protection of cultural heritage. By sheer chance, somehow, I take on from where Jennifer somehow stopped, and I will explain very briefly in images, because I'm not a legal expert, but I am an art historian by training, and I spent most of my professional life in the United States. In fact, it's the United States which turned me from being a traditional art historian. I was born in Naples, trained in Naples, studied in London, but it was when I reached the American museums that the scope and importance of their role became even more evident to me, working there for almost 8 years. You have been explained the code of cultural heritage has been addressed, and in there was the definition of cultural heritage, especially in the articles 2, 3, and 10, and for the first time it also included
intangible cultural heritage, which, as far as museums are concerned, is becoming more and more a growing issue. Many of you have heard that in recent years there has been the creation of museums of digital arts. Florence is leading in a museum of Italian language, and I'm sure we all look forward to understanding how it will be laid out. And in 2014, there was a different role of museum mission, and the museums became legal entities within the big framework of the Ministry of Culture, as it's called today. In the press at the time, we made sensational news, as they used to say, but in fact, we are part of a larger and more complex institution. And in 2016, I was invited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art to participate in what was then the Global Museum Leader Colloquium, sort of like 30 museums directors from worldwide would have 2 weeks intense seminar. And the two aspects that emerged the most was how difficult for the rest of the world the digestion of the reform of museum was, especially on legal terms, because we are not, as many other museums director, independent. We are under the supervision of the Direzione Generale Musei, which is the general museums directorship that oversees all the Italian museums and works directly with the Direzione Generale Belle Arti e Paesaggio. I would add those to the glossary because there are very complicated things to explain to fellow colleagues overseas and abroad. And it also emerged how the museums needed to have a mission statement, which generally in the other museums is intent matters. And each museum has its legal board, administration, and organizations, while Italian museums share, the independent ones, the same legal organization, and there are the first tier and the second tier museums, which never really is emphasized, but it has a very important difference. The museums, so-called first tier, the general museums are growing, but they are the minority. In Florence, the Uffizi, in Milan is Brera, in Naples, Capodimonte, Colosseum, Pompeii, just to give few examples. And they are dependent from the general secretary and from the minister directly. All the others are under what was defined in 2018 as the National Museum System. It's a very important legal passage, and I hope you will all take the time to go on the website of the Direzione Generale Musei, because it was the first legal document translated in 6 different languages: English, Portuguese, Spanish, Chinese, Russian, to give the sense of how the national system was organized, and for the first time it also defined what the definition of museum is, and what basic international standards the museums have to meet in order to be included into the national system. As the Superintendenza knows on their daily basis, there are small houses, little collection that claim that they can take care of their own collection and do their administration. Is not longer that case in a global world. So I had the privilege of being appointed as director of the Bargello. It then was called Museo Nazionale del Bargello, but I already oversaw 5 different institutions. I love these old photographs because I think that if anyone today would want to put a museum in that building, that was a jail, the current regulation and safety rules would be no way. Even the superintendent say non adatto. So it's to say how the concept of heritage and the concept of what museums represented has changed over 150 years. The Bargello was then a jail, and it only was chosen with this its gloomy aspect because it held the first portrait of Dante Alighieri. In 1840, it was unveiled. It became a sort of symbol of the national unity of Italy, and culture was already then what kept different administration and rules together. I'm very grateful that Cristina Cidini is here because I'm sure she had a very hard time during the reform, especially when she was given not only the hard task of navigating through it, but also of seeing different distributions. And I'm sure that the Bargello complex and consortium was the oddest one, because it seems like betting on the leftovers, so to speak, of what the other big museums' concept was. High revenues, ticket numbers, tourists. So this strange consortium made sense on paper because it held some of the most important buildings in Florence, the history of civic and cultural Florence, and the concept of cultural heritage in the world. In the Medici Chapel, it's buried, the Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, just to give an example. Or San Michele and Palazzo d'Avanzati and Casa Martelli were sort of like addendum because of the nature of the collection. Of San Michele holds the most important group of statuary, so somehow it's linked to the Bargello. D'Avanzati is connected to the Bargello collection, and Casa Martelli somehow has always been associated with the Medici chapels, and is now playing a role because it's really the administrative core of this museum's group. We had to start from scratch, but again, we were not alone in terms of organization. We have a governing board, which is very different from governing board in foreign museums. They have purely an advisory and sort of like supervisionary role. They are selected by the minister and by other bodies of the Ministry of Culture. We have an advisory council appointed by different institutions, university included, and we work all together as a group. And the director of regional museums has always an overseeing power in terms of both administrative choices and cultural project choices. So, in building up and developing the reform, the question what is cultural heritage became evident. And it was, we had to create not only a new identity from the legal point of view, but a new identity from the communication point of view, and from making these institutions visible. We started with what is called branding, which can seem a sort of like an antonym of preservation, but it's not so. And our challenge was to make ourselves understandable to the public, wide-ranging, and somehow museums, the way I see it, are ambassadors of what the value of cultural heritage is. We have to make really visible the importance of protection, and I would only suggest a different translation of promotion in terms of valorizzazione. In the code, valorizzazione is very much explaining the value, not only in monetary terms, but also in the cultural terms, in the value of what it costs managing all these 5 museums. And I will run through some of the museums because I think it's always important to remind what the treasuries we own, the restoration campaigns we did, over these 7 years, but also the importance of moving the attention to the so-called applied arts. What I fear was the least part of the code that was expanding was the importance of what they are still considered minor arts, while in reality they have the same cultural value as building, as works of art, as frescoes, and as other things. And I will finish just one last slide I'll go through very, very quickly. I wanted to mention the St. Mark by Donatello because it was restored thanks to the Friends of Florence in Or San Michele, and the sponsorship of private donors to the understanding of cultural art. We have now the Donatello exhibitions ongoing at Palazzo Strozzi at the Bargello. After the independent museums were established, the Friends of the Bargello became a reality, and they are an Anglo-American institution that raises money, especially for the Bargello museums, and they provided new lighting for the Salone di Donatello and new support for scholarships. So in the end, we, together with the Superintendenza, actually the Superintendenza acquired for us the Church of San Procolo, is a very important case in point of the so-called vincolo pertinenziale, because it was because of that legal instrument that the state could acquire the church, which now we are working together in co-tutoring what is project will be, what is conservation campaign will be, and what this church will become in the scope and the realm of the Bargello Museum. So to summarize, I think that museums are the best ambassadors of what cultural heritage is explained to the wide audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paolo D'Agostino. And I would like to, if I may, open to our other participants, and Sarah K. Harding, Professor Emeritus at Chicago-Kent College of Law. Do you have any idea what is cultural heritage, coming from a very different... yeah, I know it's a big question. 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
I think if you were to pose that question on a panel within the United States, you would obviously have a significant emphasis on museums and their role. But there's also a way in which the market is a massively important element, whether we like it or not, in terms of cultural heritage in the United States. Whether it be the massive art market or simply the ways in which so much of heritage is dependent on private donations and private foundations and private enterprises. So you might hear a little more about that in a presentation, I think. The other thing is, you know, when I was preparing for this panel for my own presentation, Italy's deep heritage has such continuity. Whereas in the United States and Canada and most of the New World, there's a deep rift, right, between, you know, what was a much older
before
element,
and after,
yes,
yeah,
of cultural heritage, which is indigenous peoples, Aboriginal populations, First Nations, and what cultural heritage means to them, versus, you know, what is a much more Western sort of import that, you know, sort of took over over 2 centuries or less in some cases. So I would think those are 2 other things that that very broad question you might hear a little more about in the American context.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. Both the economic dimension that Emanuele Pellegrini, a professor at IMT Lucca, will then go deeper, and the before and after, the continuity and the interruption. And Paolo Liverani, professor at the University of Florence, if you have any remarks on this topic, what is cultural heritage? Short. Then the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. My experience is I'm from half of my life a man of a museum, because I was for 20 years curator for classical antiquities in the Vatican Museum. In the second half as a professor here in Florence. So, of course, I'm highly sensible to the to the discussion, the debate about museums. But anyway, in this moment, I think there is the need to put together territory and museums, because focusing too much on museums has a high risk, because we had the older system before the last reform, integrating the two parts with scarce autonomy and identity for the museums. But now we are on the opposite extreme. So we have we are highlighting the museums, not all the museums, the major museums, and the remaining context, the territorial context, was abandoned. So we need to balance the two sides of the cultural heritage. Otherwise, we risk to lose the reason itself, the ground, the common ground of the right to culture. I will speak a little bit more on this topic in a few.
No spoiler.
Not spoiler.
And Emanuele, if you have any remark to add?
I'm an art historian, so I prefer not to reply. I won't say what is cultural heritage. No, just simply to add something to what Professor Liverani was saying. I'm looking at the images that Paolo D'Agostino showed us. I'm thinking about the fact that we are constantly trying to musealize everything, because we need to musealize for preservation, and the risk that the historic city center will be covered by fake, not to say fake or copy, and so in a certain way we are losing the authenticity of what is the context. But on the other side, it's impossible to deal with this kind of problem, because it is the case of the door of the baptistry of Florence that must be recovered in a place in order to preserve them. And it's quite strange to see that you have a different kind of behavior, because our very important horses in Venice and Venice and Padua are still an open-air setting, and other, for example, the bronze door of Bonanno in Pisa have been recovered in other museums. But the problem is that the question that we are, from one side, we have also, in this case, we have to find a balance between musealizing everything and protecting everything, and also museum has to be sustainable and not be so big and so huge, and from the other side to preserve the authenticity and of our context, the place where we live. So this is simply just a remark.
Thank you very much, and everybody really understood how it's working, so we are very happy. And Lucrezia, if you have any remarks, or we can go to the second topic.
Of course, what is cultural heritage? we start small, no?
Yes.
But yeah, what I like of this roundtable and of this conference in general is really this multidisciplinary perspective, and I think it's really enriching. And just looking at one problem, one question from different perspectives and point of view. Professor, we said no titles, so Paolo Liverani just mentioned like the focus more like on the local, on the territory, and so it made me think about this enlargement of the notion of cultural heritage, especially also referring to craftsmanship, for example, applied arts, as Paolo D'Agostino was saying, and especially in Florence, we have many examples of artisans and design, fashion, heritage, which is really starting to be considered as heritage, finally, or not, but yeah. And also the idea of like decentralized, like in museums are so important, but maybe yeah, maybe we can imagine, we can make the effort to envision different forms, different ways to really disseminate culture and to like promote and enhance like democratic, a more and more democratic way of fruition and enhancement of cultural heritage. But I would like to leave the floor to Paolo Liverani. He's full professor of topography of ancient Italy at the University of Florence and is currently also chair of the Department of History, Archaeology, Geography, Fine and Performing Arts. And as he mentioned already, he was curator of classical antiquities at the Vatican Museum from 1986 to 2005, and he will address right to culture, still a broad topic, which is actually the backbone of the law of cultural heritage, and we will give some insights on about its evolution and its current large, broader definition after following the Faro Convention ratified by Italy very recently, like in 2020. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The role of cultural heritage is an important theme in Italy with a long history, as Cristina Cidini had clearly demonstrated. The laws of Italy's pre-unification states had already tackled the problem, and the current Italian legislation is based on these experiences. More in detail, the definition of the fundamental principles is already in the legislation of the papal government in the early 19th century. Pope Pius VII had to intervene following the dramatic shock caused by the requisition by the French army of the major works of art in painting and sculpture and of the manuscript codices after the Tolentino Treatise. Consequently, the edict of the Cardinal Pacca established a series of important points: the preeminence of the public interest over the private one, a technical commission responsible for the evaluation of artistic and archaeological works and for granting licenses of archaeological excavations, the right of preemption by the government in case of export of works of archaeological or artistic interest. All these principles are now in the current Italian legislation. This brief historical excursus helps to understand the cultural heritage, that the cultural heritage has a preeminent civic function that must prevail even over legitimate economic considerations. This preeminence is sanctioned by the Italian Constitution, as we have seen, which in this field is very advanced and original. And the Article 9 states that, I quote, "The Republic promotes the development of culture and of scientific and technical research. It safeguards natural landscape and the historical and artistic heritage of the nations," end quote. The jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court has further clarified that, thanks to this article of the Constitution, the cultural heritage enjoys a stronger protection than the economic rights, even if, to be honest, this primacy is not always respected in practice. The Constitution brings together humanistic and scientific culture, natural and historical heritage in an organic and integrated way. These elements are not separable, and we are increasingly aware that they must be safeguarded and promoted as a whole. Ecology and culture are constitutive elements of a balanced and a democratic society. In a country with such an ancient tradition, the culture is strongly rooted in the territory. In Italy, cultural heritage is diffusely widespread, and there are no encyclopedic museums such as the Louvre, the British Museum, or the Metropolitan Museum of New York. Years ago, a British colleague, Tim Potter, proudly told me that the British Museum happened to be in London by accident. It was an institution of humanity that would hold its significance anywhere in the world. Obviously, this statement was not entirely true. No institution can be separated from the history and society that generated it. At the same time, however, it contained elements of truth. The British Museum's link with London and the United Kingdom is different from that existing between Italian museums and the cities where they are located. All these museums are local museums in the best sense of the word. Even the most famous and visited ones, such as the Uffizi or the Vatican Museum, which despite being in a different state, the Vatican City, is Italian from a cultural and territorial point of view. These museums are local in the sense that they cannot be understood except in relation to the history of Florence and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, in the case of the Uffizi, to the history of the territory of the Papal State in the case of the Vatican Museum. If we keep these premises in mind, it is clear why the meaning of Italian cultural heritage is, above all, civil. I don't want to use the rhetoric of roots and identities, which is quite dangerous in our days. But cultural heritage and history remind us of ties, values, and reasons giving a foundation to the national community in the highest civic and political sense of the term. In this regard, I recall the contributions by Salvatore Settis, who expressed these concepts in an articulated and profound way. In recent years, there has been an evolution in the concept of cultural property or cultural heritage and its relationship with citizens. In the past, let's say during my childhood, the term culture in Italy had a high and elitist meaning. Subsequently, this meaning underwent a, so to say, democratic evolution, acquiring a more anthropological nuance, sometimes even with the risk of being trivialized. I mean that when a term acquires too broad meaning, it becomes a passepartout, opening all the doors, but for the same reason, losing its meaningfulness. At the same time, it became clear that an elitist conception of cultural heritage, not involving enough citizens, was doomed to failure. Significant resources cannot be invested to maintain something that doesn't interest a nation. In this sense, therefore, we can speak of a right to culture. It is a civic and political right because it allows us to articulate a language and a common ground valid for the whole national community, and because, as Paul Ricoeur says, history is a reserve of unexpressed possibilities valid for the future. In a certain sense, however, there is also a symmetrical duty of culture, in the sense that citizens must take an interest and participate as much as possible in protecting and further elaborating the culture of their own community, to avoid that it remains something of the past, an archaeological relic in the worst sense of the term. Please remember, I'm an archaeologist. This change found its official and normative expression in the Faro Convention, to which Italy has recently joined. The Council of Europe Framework Convention of the Value of Cultural Heritage for Society, this is the official and complete definition, sets out several important principles. Its preamble claims that, I quote, every person has a right to engage with the cultural heritage of their choice, while respecting the rights and freedoms of others, as an aspect of the right freely to participate in cultural life, end quote. Furthermore, it recalls, I quote, the need to involve everyone in society in the ongoing process of defining and managing cultural heritage, end quote. Article 2 has an important definition, I quote, cultural heritage is a group of resources inherited from the past which people identify independently of ownership as a reflection and expression of their constantly evolving values, beliefs, knowledge, and traditions. It includes all aspects of the environment resulting from the interaction between people and places through time. We have so far examined the problem from a theoretical point of view. Let's now go down to the Italian concrete reality. Let's see there are shadows and lights. The shadows. The cultural sector, despite the constitutional protection it should enjoy, is the first to suffer economic cuts. And this theme is present in the public discussion, but no convincing solutions to support in a more significant way the sector have been proposed until now. Indeed, the recent political decision went in the opposite direction. In 2014, the reform of the Ministry of the Cultural Heritage, beyond the declared intention, greatly weakened the capacity of the territorial offices for the protection of the cultural heritage. The superintendencies have few staffs and with a very high average age. Few funds, especially to pay for the travels needed to control the territory. The museums have been separated, as I mentioned. Furthermore, there is a scarce dialogue between the Ministry of Culture and the university. While on a personal level, the relationship between colleagues of the superintendency and the university are very good, at institutional level, the dialogue is lacking, and new rules severely limits the possibility of carrying out archaeological research by the university. The name itself, Ministry of Culture, means that school and university are not part of the culture. Now let's see the lights. Today we are talking about culture much more than before. It is a subject of great political importance, even if it is easily manipulated. Evaluating the quality of the cultural offer and its impact on society is a difficult topic for the front pages of the newspaper. The Italian society has numerous cultural associations and a strong sensibility on issues concerning the cultural heritage. But it is necessary to evaluate the results of this opinion movement in the medium term and to understand its real structural impact. Yes, summing up, we live in a time of great change with some potentialities and many risks, where it is difficult to make predictions, where theoretical progress in focusing on the importance of cultural heritage doesn't go hand in hand with its practical implementation. In other words, before we can declare the right to culture truly realized, a maturation and strong involvement of society will be necessary, trying to avoid, on the one hand, economic shortcuts, favoring market laws also in the field of cultural heritage, on the other, an ideological and instrumental use of culture. Thank you.
Thank you. And so if anyone has some comments on that.
Paola, do you want to comment
on the right of culture or the relationship between university and ministry?
I saw an eyebrow going up and down, so as in a talk show, we immediately went
Sorry,
there.
I'm Neapolitan, so it's kind of like, I'm very expressive.
Feel free.
I agree with, of course, most of Professor Liverani said. It was just raising the brows because in my humble experience, the relationship between Ministry of Culture and University has never been so close. I mean, there have been regional research fellowship given in the territory and in the university. The Bargello was given a so-called PRIN, which I'm sure you all know. No. Yes, no, at the central level, I'm coming to the central level. No, I was like, no. But I'm thinking when I was a student and I was trying to be a part of the museum world, that's why I was saying in a humble opinion. At the central level, I may be wrong, but I think that they are trying to communicate more and create a cross-ministry commission. Maybe you are in the academic world and you don't know, but I'm told, yeah.
I can react because I can confirm, at least from our side, there is much more in very recent, after the reform, basically.
Yeah, so I'm not raising the brows. Mine was more of a hoping thing. And on a personal level, we did an exhibition together last year, making at the center and the center of honor manuscript, which is the most, as you know, unappealing. If they are not illuminated objects, but they were in a different frame.
We have dozens of collaboration with Pessina,
yeah, no, we all do.
For example.
But
the problem is at the highest level.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. At the highest level, from what we hear, they are trying very hard, but maybe we only hear on the ministry side, in the sense that there are many protocols that they are trying to establish with the more.
Is to apply. The problem is to apply.
Yeah, the protocol.
And, you don't know the rules for archaeological excavation. Is nearly impossible.
Okay, so from the local, let's go global.
I don't want to be polemic, but in Pompeii they are possible. The University of Naples is doing, yeah, okay, so I touch on different things. Complicated.
I can't provide these kind of fireworks. But I had to, relatively dull compared to this sort of local debate about this connection. My thoughts when I read the paper and heard it presented here is that in some ways this is the most central thing, right? The right to culture is the thread that throughout, sort of generations is, providing or weaving together different fabrics of what's important to us culturally, right? And so as we sort of experience a greater democratization, a greater sort of diversification of culture, it weaves in together all these other kinds of cultural heritage, right? Whether it's more of the artisan element or the intangible cultural heritage, which I'll talk about. So it's this it's this notion of a cultural right, which is just like that thread or that magnet that keeps pulling things into it. The other thing I wanted to mention, which I think is a really important topic, and we don't hear enough about it, is what you mentioned as the opposite side, the duty, right? You can't have a cultural right, you can't have any kind of right without a corresponding duty. And where does that duty lie? And who participates in that? And obviously it's a collective duty, just like it's a collective right. That is the discussion about duties in cultural heritage is, aside from sort of, the basic pragmatic duties of like preservation and things like that, but the concept of the duties that are incumbent on all of us to sort of preserve culture, we don't talk much about. Certainly in the United States, we don't.
Manuel?
No, I will go with my...
And Paul, if you have any reply? No? All right.
So thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. And for organizational purposes, we will go first with Emanuele that has a train to catch. we have time, but just to be safe, on the safe side. And Emanuele is going directly on the cultural heritage as an economic resource, so the economic dimension that was touched upon also by Sarah at the beginning. And Emanuele, I just remember, as a professor at IMT Lucca, and Flor is yours.
Thank you. I'm pretty sure that the organizer was searching for a victim when they decided to have this topic, because as you probably know, talking about economic value of cultural heritage is quite challenging, especially in Italy. So I'm here, I'm offering myself as a lamb for the sacrifice. But I would like to be very brutal, so to say. I'm thinking about this topic. I have two possibilities. The first one is to say the same things that we heard. And I totally agree with Professor Liverani. I mean, we can say that the right of culture, but basically the economic value of cultural heritage is there and is always there. So I can go for this simply path, this very clear path, but I would like to choose a different perspective. And I was thinking about, I mean, basically the cultural heritage as economic value. I think we can see the problem from a twofold perspective. So the cultural heritage is an economic value from a very direct point. It is money. There are some monetary value behind art objects and palaces like this. This is a very direct point. There is the indirect point, that is the indirect revenues, tourism, advertising, copyright, and all what is around the cultural heritage. But we have to keep in mind this distinction. I mean, they're saying the two sides of the same coin, but there are different sides. I mean, and I will, basically the first side is less present in public debate, as you probably know. When we're talking about economic values, cultural heritage, it's always talking about the symbolic values, the indirect revenues, the tourism. The direct values is always a little bit hidden in the public debate. And I'm thinking about this short speech. I will go back with the memory to the 1965 publication of the monograph issue of this magazine, Critica d'Arte, which was a shock in the art world at that time, because Critica d'Arte published a complete monetary estimate of the Uffizi Gallery and of many other palaces in the historical city center of Florence. When I say monetary estimates, it means that there was a list of all the objects, all the art objects of the Uffizi and the palace of the Uffizi with the monetary value in dollars that was made by, so the Venus of Botticelli, Correggio, Caravaggio, and you have the price besides. What is really shocking and interesting that this monetary value was put aside the financial statement of the administration of cultural heritage. So basically you can immediately see that you have a cultural heritage that is worth on the art market billion and billion and billion of dollars, and you have a public administration that is spending for this huge amount of money, just a few of his budget. So it was a proposal, of course, just for épater les bourgeois, and so it was shocking. There was a lot of reaction and everyone fearing that someone would like to sell the cultural heritage. It was not so, of course. And what is really interesting, probably this is the right place where to say something like this, that this initiative was based on laws. And basically on two laws, the Regio Decreto dating back to 1923, and the Regolamento, after this decreto that was published in May 1924, according to which the cultural heritage preserved in the historical buildings and historical building itself must be evaluated in monetary terms, so to say. So the Italian state was forced to know, at least at the general level, the value, the monetary value of his real estate, so to say. So it was a thought that I don't know what's happening today, basically. I don't know if today what is the rule. I know if it's you're still obliged to have the same. So every year. So a nightmare. But I'm coming to the second part. I'm pretty sure. What is the perspective of the Critica d'Arte issue that was, of course, in the middle of the work of the Commissione Franceschini, which is one of the most important committee for the preservation of cultural heritage. So, right, it was a way just to shock the public opinion on the problem. And of course, but if we see the problems the other way around, we can see that, of course, it's knowing the value, the economic value of cultural heritage is that you can really know if this value is going to diminish in the year, for example, for damage, loss, flood, climate change, as we heard. So you can keep, or illicit trafficking, for example, you can keep the value of what you have. Mind. This initiative was not new. It was very interesting, the one at the end of 19th century by Giovan Battista Cavalcaselle, with the initiative of selling part of these art objects preserved in the storage of the Uffizi. There was an exhibition organized in Palazzo Vecchio with more than 5,000 paintings coming from the storage of the Uffizi. Part of these paintings have to be selected by a committee and just to be put on the art market. What is interesting that part of this committee, there was Stefano Bardini, who was the king of antiquarians, I mean, an expert in finding the monetary value of cultural heritage. Of course, the two examples came to my mind when I read with great interest what happened with the Guercino and the casino of Villa Ludovisi in these very days. As you know, the Villa Ludovisi has been put on the art market, and art historians have been forced to estimate, evaluate, not only the villa, but also the mural decoration, in particular the painting of Caravaggio. I mean, there are 471 millions of euro, and the painting by Caravaggio with 380 millions of euros, so more than a half of the value of the villa is for the... of course, I would like to say just simply that we tend to forget this physical value of cultural heritage, and we tend to remember just simply, as they were stating, there is a nightmare to evaluate, because of course there is this the symbolic value, which is something that is more striking. And what is interesting that it's quite normal for us to see billions of euros to be spent for Picasso, Van Gogh, Kiffen, or Hearst, and we are a little bit shocked when these money are associated with the name of Caravaggio in a villa in the center of Rome. Because here, this is the second and final part of the short speech, is the symbolic value. Of course, the symbolic value is something that we cannot estimate. It's impossible. We cannot give any value to the Venus of Botticelli, to the Caravaggio painting, which is the only mural painting by Caravaggio. As Cole says, it's not possible to give a value. But however, sometimes we are forced to do so. And the symbolic value can be exploited for indirect revenues. I mean, using and abusing cultural heritage for doing money. Professor Liverani is saying correctly that the first aim of cultural heritage is the civic identity and a public role. But however, there is this opposing forces fighting in the field of cultural heritage and in the use of cultural heritage as cultural heritage. This dichotomy has a lot of reasons, in my opinion, because the Italian cultural heritage during the centuries, even masterpiece, had risked several times to be put on the art market or to get lost or being abused for profit. The question is very complicated because it affects education, preparation of experts, and so on and so forth. But in recent years, I see that also according to the evolution of legislation and administrative practice, I see that this a better consciousness of the boundaries between private and public spheres lowered a little bit this tension. I'm pretty sure I want to be just give an hope to this. And also to find different and brilliant solutions for the management of cultural heritage. But I would like to finish in saying that we cannot ignore this very concrete value of cultural heritage. And the knowledge of value of cultural heritage, both direct and indirect value of cultural heritage, it is necessary to maintain and to preserve the cultural heritage. And this awareness, in my opinion, it is the first step for towards any solution for the preservation of cultural heritage, and first of all, the benefits for the population. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuele. Thank you very much. You were brave enough to jump in. And following your provocation, one could wonder whether there are countries that have oil, diamonds, and gold, and dug from the earth, and we dug from the earth cultural heritage as our resource in a sense. So I can make a round of observation. Anybody wants to jump in on this hot and interesting topic? Paolo.
Yes, of course, it's absolutely necessary to consider also from the patrimonial point of view the cultural heritage. This is the importance of the inventories. If you have good inventories updated, the patrimony total of the state increases and the debt lower. So it is absolutely, I agree completely. I'm less in agreement with the historical comparison with the oil, because there is a consumption of resource, and the cultural heritage, if considered in this way, risks a consumption. On the other hand, you have to maintain, to increase, to develop this patrimony. So it is a risky terminology, because from the word there are some consequences. So
a provocation is a provocation. I was aware of this. And Sarah, do you want to?
Just one quick observation. When we juxtapose the economic value with symbolic, the interesting thing, again, sort of approaching this from a comparative perspective, is what is the symbolic value of what exists in the Met in the United States, right? And it doesn't have that deep cultural, it's an amazing, right, phenomenal institution, right? But what it's symbolizing, I think, is something very different than what museums here symbolize in terms of the cultural heritage. I'd love to know if you disagree, but it's if anything, it symbolizes, along with the British Museum, a power, right, and acquisition, and colonialism, and all these other things that are about acquiring what's in the rest of the world. So it's a very different contrast of symbol and economic value. And I think there's just as much, or there's frequently just as much consternation in the press at home if the Met or the Art Institute in Chicago suddenly says we're going to sell something. It's just like, you can't sell, that this is our local Chicago Art Institute or the Met or whatever. But what it symbolizes is, I think, something that is very different, and it's not any disagreeing or whatever, it's just a different perspective on how we contrast economic value with what else is there.
And Paola, can you sell Donatello to make the balance sheet even?
No.
I'm being provocative, yes, but we are in
no,
the
no,
afternoon.
No, but it's good being provocative. I think that's the importance of this round table. Unlike United States, once something goes into Italian state patrimony, it can never be alienated, or it takes so long to be deaccessioned that it's basically impossible. And for that reason, I think all of us are being much more cautious before accepting something, even as donations, as all other institutions worldwide are. In the beginning of 20th century, up to the Second World War, everyone wanted to donate anything it was accepting worldwide. Now everyone is being more cautious, not only because of the lack of space, but also because how the value and the meaning of works of art or art objects is changing over time, and things that were considered valuable then turned out to be fakes or something that no one would ever acquire as a work of art. I think what is important, and in terms of either monetary or symbolic value, is what No. Sarah said about the Met, I totally agree. And I was there when there was the deaccessioning campaign, and it was a nightmare. It was really a nightmare for the people who had to make the decision, for how it was perceived. On the other end, at that time was considered necessary. And I always am very doubtful about expressing fears and unilateral judgments, because in many cases you have to balance and be in that historic and economic moment. What I think was important as a value was I think 1965 was really provocative in trying to raise awareness of how little, and still in a way, how little in all the budget of the Italian government is invested into the management of cultural heritage. And I'm not only talking about monetary values, because if you look at different budget, you can say, oh, but you are not penniless. It's more in terms of the percentage and most of all, human resources in terms of, having that turnover that should come from universities into all other institutions, into the ministry. So I think the value of culture in terms of monetary is not only in terms of equivalence of money, works of art, but the price of managing whole in terms of managing the people who can manage. And I think that is evident not only in Italy, but worldwide. And during the pandemic, we were privileged, so to speak, but other museums worldwide had cuts and shortage of staff. And it was the fierceless cut that went to culture, and they didn't have a choice. So we were privileged not to face that, but now we have to have the value in terms of not only money, but in terms of quality of human resources who are put as an investment in our cultural heritage.
Thank you, Paola. Very interesting. Emanuele, do you want the floor back, or no? You are done for today. You are not. Lucrezia.
You run and catch the train before it's too late. No, thank you. That was really. I was really thinking about the accession in debate, and we also had the chance to visit the pulpito in Sant'Andrea Church in Pistoia, where there is an interesting story that was about Stefano Bardini just bringing, just under his arm, one beautiful eagle from 14th century, and just put it into the market, and that eagle is like now at the Met, so I ended up at the Met. So.
But they sent back a beautiful...
Yeah, a beautiful mold, a beautiful copy, like in 2001, so after like many, many years. Yeah, and I also wanted to just very briefly just make a connection also to one of our panels tomorrow about this skepticism and this Italian skepticism towards this dichotomy, I would say, economy and culture, and thinking about the debate about the reproduction of cultural heritage. So one of the main aspects at stake is about the commercial reuse of digital images, and of course is like use and abuse of images of cultural heritage for making money. And so, yeah, one of the reasons is, of course, we want to make revenues, and we want to valorize these IP resources, but I think that the strongest reason is really related to our culture of cultural heritage, to quote Alessandra. So our just assumption. It's just something that it's really really rooted in our identity, and but also thinking about also the reuse of images of cultural heritage, not only to make money, but maybe to circulate and to spread culture and knowledge. So in a more, in a broader sense of also what is right to culture, for example. So not only preserving, but also promoting the knowledge and promoting the access and the fruition and the enjoyment. We have our last, not last, but our last in presence speaker. So Sarah Harding is Professor Emeritus at Chicago Kent College of Law, and she's a widely recognized teacher and scholar in the areas of comparative constitutional law and the law of cultural heritage. And today she will give us an insight on the current status of law, policy, and scholarship on intangible cultural heritage in the United States, with also some references to the situation, to the Italian current status. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have to start by expressing what a privilege this is for me to be here. I have spent some time in Florence, very gratefully, and most of the time, though, here talking about comparative constitutional law. So this is the first time I've got my cultural heritage hat on, and it's really a great joy to participate on this panel. A couple introductory things. First is a definitional issue, which I'm not even sure ranks in the sort of difficult sort of translation issues, but this was originally labeled immaterial cultural heritage as a panel. Intangible cultural heritage tends to be the word that is used the most, particularly internationally. But it would be really interesting to do a little exploration of what those two terms actually, because they do evoke slightly different things. But I will be using the term intangible cultural heritage throughout my talk. Just that's the one that I'm most comfortable with. The last little introductory thing is that this is a really, like all of these subjects, very large. I feel like most of this conference, particularly because it's here in Italy, is really focused on material cultural heritage. So I feel like I have an impossible task of trying to cover an entire area. And so it will be pretty general. And I hope that some of the thoughts or ideas I have, even if they're just thrown out in a sentence or a word, that it connects to some of the other presentations and over the next couple days of the conference. I do have a few slides you'll see in a moment, but generally speaking, I'm not going to be relying on PowerPoint. So I want to start off with a really obvious, probably deeply uninteresting point, which is that intangible cultural heritage is by definition not fixed. Of course, it can be fixed in the copyright sense, right? A song can be put to paper, but the essence of the heritage isn't what is on the paper, right? The essence of the heritage is the form of the creative expression, right? As you hear it, not as you read those notes on a paper. So in this sense, right, and it's probably the most important difference from tangible cultural heritage, is that there's no material anchor. There's maybe in some cases, but there's not necessarily any material anchor or object that is the cultural expression. And thus all meaning is subject to greater changeability, greater mutability. Right? It's more subject to change over time. So what are we talking about more concretely in terms of intangible cultural heritage? I'm sure you all know. We're talking about songs, stories, dances, folklore, oral histories, natural and medicinal knowledge, religious rituals. We're talking about a massive realm of cultural expression that simply is, again, not anchored or rooted into a material object necessarily. In the introduction to a book in 2019 about the legal protections of intangible cultural heritage, Professor Scovazzi, I hope I said that correctly, defined it as the fundamental components of the concept of intangible cultural heritage seem to be, one, a practice That's sort of an objective component. 2, a community of people as a subjective component. And 3, a cultural environment. Right? So a practice, a community of people, and a cultural environment. I actually really liked that sort of distillation of what we're talking about when we talk about intangible cultural heritage. The most important document in the area is a UNESCO convention from 2003, the Convention on Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage. It, in terms of its definition, refers to domains, 5 domains. They are oral traditions and expressions, performing arts, social practices and rituals and festive events, all thrown into one, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, and traditional craftsmanship. These are the sort of the categories. No, there's no geographically fixed component to these, right? It's generated and connected to regions or communities, but not fixed to that place. And so here's where I want to show a slide. That's intangible cultural heritage, okay? It's a psychedelic experience, really, when it comes right down to it. This is actually, if you were to go on to the website for the convention, the 2003 convention, this is an interactive, so I've just taken a screenshot, but it's an interactive representation of intangible cultural heritage. As you move your mouse over everything, it sort of pops up all sorts of things and connections and places. When you look at all that green stuff in the middle, those green bits are places, right? And interestingly, the large green is representing regions. In intangible cultural heritage, all of Western Europe and all of North America is represented with one of those green blobs, right? Whereas Eastern Europe gets its own green blob. And this just gives you a little introduction to sort of, again, sort of how this and where this is going and how this is skewed towards non-Western, non-North American nations and more skewed towards developing nations and those that have participated less in the protection of tangible cultural heritage over time. This is one more representation of it. These are fascinating things to play with if you have an hour just to sort of see what all the connections are. All of those links are showing us not only what the nature of a particular intangible cultural heritage is, but how it connects to something else that's very similar in an entirely different place. So it really creates this dynamic web of culture as opposed to something that is more linked to one specific geographic place. And one more slide, and this will be it. Right, that's World Cultural Heritage on the right, as represented again on the UNESCO sort of World Heritage site. So it's very dotted in terms of regions and places, and obviously, but it's just I think a good visual representation of what we're talking about here. So the distinctive elements, as defined again within the convention, are that intangible cultural heritage is traditional and contemporary. There's a lot of, it's both yin and yang, there's a lot of this going on. It's living at the same time as its inherited tradition. It's inclusive. We think of much of tangible cultural heritage as exclusive. Right? It is inclusive in that it's not the idea or practices that are specific to a certain culture, but rather it's about building social cohesion, both locally and more globally. It's representative. It's not meant to be, sort of exhausted. It's meant to be representative. So intangible cultural heritage isn't just a cultural good, but it's a representation of the kinds of local knowledge and skills. And then finally, it's very community-based. Intangible heritage only exists if it's broadly recognized within a group and a community. So why did this emerge in 2003? I could go back to sort of a theoretical sort of discussion of cultural rights as that thread, but there is a short history here which is also sort of telling. The idea of having a convention in this area was first mentioned in the 1970s, and it was mentioned by a developing nation, Bolivia. There were many intermediate steps before we get to 2003. There was sort of UNESCO recommendations on safeguarding traditional culture and folklore. There was a proclamation of the masterpieces of oral and intangible heritage, very much based on the sort of World Heritage approach. And then finally, there was this need to have something that was a slightly more binding instrument, and that's when we get the 2003 convention. So domestically here in Italy, which I know very little about, but I do know that that convention was ratified here in Italy in 2007. It's the only specific national regulation on intangible cultural heritage that I'm aware of. There's no other national sort of organic legislation that covers specifically intangible cultural heritage. But as I mentioned, it had ratified the convention, and Italy has 12 of those crazy dots up there that are recognized and on the list of intangible cultural heritage. I'm not going to go through all 12 of them. They struck me as bizarre because they don't strike me as the core elements of what we define or I think of as Italian intangible cultural heritage. There's only one food element on there. There's no fashion elements on there. What there are falconry, which is also shared by 24 other nations, so you get a sense of how it's this kind of vast sort of sharing of things. Falconry, the Mediterranean diet is actually on there, believe it or not. And this sort of would take us to the economic quality of this, because that's something like a certification mark that can be then marketed. And then there's there's things that seem more a natural connection, like Cremona violin making or Sicilian puppetry. So it's an interesting list. It's very small, but it's an interesting list. If you're interested, I'll send it to you. There is more law at the regional level, I understand, in Italy, a lot of law at the regional level dealing with intangible cultural heritage. I understand Tuscany in particular has a very strong set of regulations and robust sort of rules and laws in this area. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, the Constitution, I understand the Constitution does not limit itself to tangible cultural heritage, that it's expansive enough that it could include and does include intangible cultural heritage. But then coming to the code, which I have learned more about today than in my entire academic career before, which is just wonderful, has some reference to it, but it's really passing reference, secondary, not a core element of that code. Turning very quickly again on this legislative piece to the U.S. U.S. has not even joined the convention. We could talk about why that is, but I'll leave that for now. There are some random U.S. laws that might fit into this area. There's something called the Indian Arts and Craft Act, which is sort of like a trademark certification sort of authenticity approach. But there's very little there. So that's sort of very briefly the sort of the legislation and how it's unfolded. An important aspect of this history is really the role of developing nations, which I've mentioned a couple times now in passing. Both here in UNESCO, as well as other international organizations, the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, it's the developing nations and indigenous peoples that have been pushing for recognitions of intangible cultural heritage. And there's a very obvious reason for that, which is that these are nations and populations that have less material culture. And so much of what is important to them in terms of preservation is this sort of form of traditional cultural expression, not necessarily the tangible element that might go along with it. In this way, it's clearly deeply embedded within this broader category of cultural rights. It's very much sort of the ways in which indigenous peoples in particular have pushed for recognition of their rights and their cultural rights through intangible cultural heritage, not through sort of retention of material cultural heritage. So that's one important element of the history, is the role of developing nations in this. The second I want to mention is that while intangible cultural heritage, we could say, came second in time, right? It's obviously falling on the heels of a large amount of legislation and internationally and domestically focused on tangible cultural heritage. I wouldn't say it's derivative of that body of law. If anything, I would say they're deeply interdependent, and many of the debates and issues around protecting or safeguarding or promoting intangible cultural heritage are very, they shed light on some of the difficult issues even with tangible cultural heritage, in particular when we get to definitions, right? 1 minute left. I'm the only one who ran out of time. Okay, so there is very much this interdependency with respect to them. So I do want to say one last thing then, since I'm running out of time, is that there are many ways to think of how we approach intangible cultural heritage. The 2003 convention takes a safeguarding approach. And that safeguarding approach is really, the hallmarks are identification, documentation, transmission, revitalization, promotion. It's all about ensuring maintenance and vitality. The intellectual property organizations in the WTO focus mostly on protection, on ways in which indigenous peoples of developing nations can fence it off, right, through something akin to a hybrid sort of intellectual property right. Right, so there's all sorts of debates in there about how that area, intellectual property, blends with this. The 2003 convention took a completely different approach, focusing only on that safeguarding, and it's all about just publicizing it and getting the information out there. Okay, I only want to say one more thing, and just because I think it's one of the most interesting things about this whole area, and particularly the tension between the convention and other approaches, is that the convention and a lot of the scholarship around it make it very clear, right, that this has nothing to do with authenticity. That authenticity and authentic sort of expressions of cultural heritage have no place in this convention, in the sense of the idea that what it really recognizes, the convention, right, is the evolving nature of heritage, right? And so to this extent, if we were going to spend a lot more time on this, we would explore that sort of definitional issue of how do you fix something, put it down, get it on a list, but then also say, oh, but that's not authentic. You know, it's whatever happens, you know, down the road and as we see it evolve. So I'll leave it at that. Hope that I haven't gone over too much, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, the definitional issue is so crucial, even because we know that as juries, that if we don't have a definition, that's much harder to have also proper legal treatment and adequate protection also. Anyone has special comments on this very broad topic?
Emanuele, you want to start? If you have
No. I have in the sense that the problem here is the authenticity. To me, is one of the core points, because authenticity and intangible cultural heritage is a very. I never thought about it, but it's really a very relevant problem. And I'm also thinking about something what happened in the fashion and in food also, with the problem of sort of a replication of branding and so on. This affect the way in which cultural heritage is considered. So the problem of authenticity, I think, is one of the core point in this reflection, and it can be, I think, in the future, it can be one of the hot topic of in the debate.
And Paola, do you have something?
I don't have anything specific to say. I was fascinated by the description and by the graphic, and I was thinking, except of all the international laws and etc., how is the rest of the community perceiving intangible culture? Like, everything is codified and there are rules, but how people know that there is something that is intangible culture outside of the legal issues? Like, what is the gap between the legal and the norm and the reception of it as shared cultural heritage? How do we make that, aside from the legal aspect, becoming part of our common knowledge?
Yeah, that's really related to also how to make access effective.
Exactly.
If
So
we can make archives, digitize all our resources, objects, knowledge, but how can you make them known? And
Yeah, sure.
Sure. I just want to say two quick things that connect both of your remarks. The first is, I think there's a lot of interesting conversation regarding authenticity here, because while the convention seems to very directly move away from that concept, most indigenous peoples would say, oh no, right, that the authenticity of our tradition is precisely why we want to fence it off and not have it on a list and not share it and not have it be something that is for mass consumption and like lots of global sharing. There's very different approaches given what kind of community you're talking about. And then that connects to yours in that I think I think if you were to stop anybody on a street in Italy or in the United States, they would have no idea what you're talking about if you said intangible cultural heritage. But indigenous peoples would, for example, because it's such an important component of their cultural rights. Not all of them, of course, but it's so central to how they define their cultural rights. And so it's something that they might have a stronger understanding of than the standard Italian or American citizen.
And if I may jump in, also the issue that is neighborhood is there in what you said of appropriation, no? Of somebody's intangible cultural heritage. You say, you like this dress, it's colorful, it has a nice way of putting it on body, and somebody will say, look, but this dress is important to me because it's an expression of my culture, and you are just taking it away from me. Now, this is another element here.
yeah.
Okay, I just have to. Because in fact, the other populations that would have a stronger sense of their cultural heritage are minority populations, whether they're indigenous peoples or not. There's huge public political debates over, whether it's appropriate to wear a sombrero to a Mexican-themed party if you're not Mexican. Whether or not it's appropriate to put your hair in cornrows if you're not African American. There's been huge debates. They don't really emerge within the legal sphere, but it's a massive political hot button. And it's really about concerns about misappropriating, again, sort of different cultural traditions, even if they're not on a list sometimes.
Yeah, and it's also maybe something related to, the solution maybe is not even legal, because maybe IP rights is not the solution because they are not the appropriate requisites. And for example, it should be framed like there should be framed like policy measures, for example, or also attribution rules. So let's think about broadly also with informal, extra-legal, let's say, rules, I would say.
If Paolo has
Yeah,
any remarks,
something to add? No.
So,
We have one
Felicia.
comment.
Yeah.
Let's go wild.
We can.
Thanks, Lucrezia. And first, thank the panel so much for your perspectives. But as you spoke about the right to culture and the duty to preserve, and we have this dialogue on the screen. I was wondering, especially because each of you have had either, Sarah, are American or in the U.S. context, or, Paula have worked in the U.S. or at the Vatican or had experiences with American curators. What do you think? I know the panel is about the role of cultural heritage in Italy, but what might the U.S. be able to give Italy? One of the things that struck me today about this panel and how we've been describing Italian cultural heritage is that at times it seems like a monolith, but there are so many problematic parts of Italian cultural heritage as well. So I think, for example, of the change to the bassorilievo in Bolzano and the change to Italian cultural heritage, or the need to grapple with parts of Italian cultural heritage that are very problematic today, how Italy is becoming more diverse and has always been very regionally diverse. And so I'm wondering if, especially if we think about how the U.S. exists in a very extra-legal, we might say, cultural heritage normative framework, how we do document, for example, folk song through the Library of Congress as intangible cultural heritage. I'm wondering if the panel might speak a little bit to how Italy and the U.S. might be in dialogue with each other, recognizing that we have this, as Jennifer spoke about today, very rich normative framework in Italy, but that the U.S. too, especially with Americans that have been in Florence, as we've discussed today, might also, I'm wondering if the panel thinks the American community also has something unique to contribute to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia.
Who wants to?
I'll just take a quick stab. I think if there's anything that, I'm not sure it's a contribution, but I think of the American approach in all of this as 1,000 points of light in some way, right? Instead of an overarching, sort of top-down approach to this incredibly important topic of cultural heritage, I think it emerges in all these little, perhaps non-legislative, but sort of practice ways. Even with respect to intangible cultural heritage, there are these, it's like the National Historic Preservation Act has any time there's any federal development or project, they have to actually go through a process of determining, is this going to impact any kind of Native American cultural ritual, right? That's protecting intangible cultural heritage, but it's a regulation called Section 106 or something like that within the National Historic Preservation Act. And it's dealt with by the Parks Service, really. So I think that it's there, as you say. It just doesn't have that sort of cohesive, as you said, monolithic sort of presence. So I'm not sure that's a contribution, but it's certainly another way to think about it.
Anybody else? Paula?
Yes, but
There's another question.
I don't know if it's related to.
But do you want to, or you want to address Felicia's question first?
Oh, okay. No, I just wanted to make a brief comment about the fact that I think from my own experience, and I may be totally wrong, in America, especially in the last 20 years, there is a very hot political issue in terms of culture, minority, and codes. Somehow, Italy has always been diverse. So what seems like a monolithic approach in terms of regulations and rules, in fact, in the collection and in the territory, we have integrated different cultures already, which are part of our history. As a personal note, when I was telling, not personal for me, but personal in terms of my working experience, you know that there is in the United States, in Italy, in Europe, this idea of inclusion, of social inclusion, of how different cultures can be embedded and brought into it. And when we had a series of projects dealing with adult cultures. We had a series of projects in 2018 with the Islamic community when we had the big show, Florence and the Islamic World, but somehow they resisted that because they don't feel different. We had second generation Chinese who were born in Prato who said, we are Italian, so we don't feel that our own culture is different from yours. So in our case, what we have been doing, and that's why I was saying ambassadors to understand what is cultural heritage, is the shared story of Italy, and in a way the collections that I oversee have an encyclopedic nature because of various reasons that I'm not going to repeat here. We have different cultures, we have Persian, we have Chinese, we have different, not only Italian and Florentine, but somehow in southern Italy, we have so many objects and artifacts that would be called Islamic or would be called Northern Europe, and they simply are not perceived by us and by immigrants who are first or second generations. So our mediation has been different. It's like encouraging the younger generation to make the first generation familiar with their own culture, but they don't want to be labeled as separate from Italians. They feel and they claim that they are being Italian. So it's a very complicated issue, but it's more of a social, somehow in Italy I perceive that there is a difference. We can learn a lot in terms of diplomacy and cultural, but in terms of diversity, I think that we are on a different ground as it stands now, although there is a tension, but it's a tension that it's more general. Even in the music, even in the rap and in what is happening in Lombardy, for instance, you have singers who are Italians and they claim to be Italians, but they don't see their being Italian as being different from being Muslim. For them, it's not a separate issue as it was.
So that comment is really interesting to me. It relates exactly to what I wanted to say, which is if what you're describing is true, it's a huge change because my grandparents who emigrated from what is now called Italy didn't consider themselves Italian at all.
No.
They considered themselves, well, my grandmother considered herself Neapolitan and my grandfather considered himself from Valdosta. And they spoke dialect and they didn't think of the Italian state as real, I would say. So it's interesting that Italy equates cultural heritage with Italian national heritage in a country that has just so recently been put together in the scheme of things. And this raises the question to me whether Italy is a qualified superintendent of Venetian culture, for example, or of Florentine culture. Meaning, they may have the Italians of today may have the best of intentions, but the Italians of today are psychologically a million miles away from the Italians of Bellini in Venice. And in fact, my grandparents are closer. They're Americans, they're dead, but they were, when they were alive, they were essentially psychologically closer to the people who were producing the culture, so much for the culture that Italy is superintending, than Italians, modern Italians are today. So does that figure in thinking within Italy about how to administer Italian cultural heritage law?
I quickly reply as a Toscan, and I feel the words of Dante judging Lucchesi, Pistoiese still very, very contemporary for me. So and Pisani. So if I want to assure you, I'm still in the Middle Age as a Toscan. I'm not from Florence, so I'm still in the Middle Age. So, but I'm quite old, so I'm not in the new generation. So no, of course, I'm joking.
I have no special. My name is Michele Graziadei. I'm a comparative law professor from Torino. Your point is a very important point, and it poses the question: what is the Italian culture as such? Now, that question is very relevant to cultural property, of course, because if you find something that is from Magna Graecia, you know, the old remains of the Greek civilization in Italy, and we claim it's part of our cultural heritage, perhaps the Greek could say, hey, stop, this is to us. So that's a problem that sooner or later will come out. And it does already come out in a way. But your question is different, and that is to say, how do Italians relate to their regional past, their local allegiances, and so on? If you ask to a citizen of Siena, and I use the word citizen with purpose, who that person is, he will immediately say that he is Sienese, first of all. Let's forget about anything else. This double identity, as our colleague has just said, is with us all along our lives. If you are from Rome, you move to Torino, 20 years on, you will still be from Rome. You have adapted, yes, we understand you have adapted, but you are from Rome because you speak with that accent, and I am from Torino, I'm here in Florence, everybody is aware that I am from Torino, of course, because my accent is Piemontese, and this is stronger than being from California or Vermont, or because the local importance is the local dimension of your life is probably richer for a number of reasons. I hope I have answered your question.
I just want to say, I think there's a huge difference between a Texan and a Vermonter. So they may take umbrage at what you just said. And actually, I'm Canadian. And so most people, and I only recently became an American citizen, so I think of myself really as fundamentally Canadian. Yeah, but I lived in the United States for 27 years now.
I've already asked a few people, but let me now ask the panel, if it would not be the case to think of a prolegomenon to the dialogue with the United States that this conference would like to launch, which should consist perhaps in a few pages, and this is what people have just been saying, of Italian history. Because while Paolo Liverani's emphasis on the civic importance of what is perceived as cultural heritage is very great in Italy, the concept of the civitas, the concept of the political community and its historical reality is so different from anything that the ordinary or even cultivated American can easily imagine, because it has this millenary stratification, Italy being geographically a crossroads and having willingly accepted so many different cultures and found remarkable ways of uniting them. And that has to be made apparent to the other party in the dialogue, because it is not immediately obvious. And with that, and it's what in various ways several people have been saying, the consequent 18th and 19th century effort brought to a high point in the Risorgimento and even in the 1939 legislation to overcome regional difficulty through the creation, even artificial creation, of a sense of national identity. Which is one of the great artifacts, if you like, not yet perfected. But all of that has to be somehow recounted to the other party in the dialogue, because it's so different from American experience that the risk is using the same terms, like national identity or civic identity, with totally different connotations. That wasn't a question, it was a statement. But
It's a comment. Anybody has any remarks on this?
The remarks, of course, and then, so if you don't, okay. So I may be the only finance guy here in the room, despite in my previous life being a lawyer. So I was really thinking that depending on the weight that you attribute to minor cultures, talking, the old imperialist way, or the intangible cultural heritage, Italy is ceded to a certain percentage of the global cultural heritage. The old imperialist way is something around 90%. New estimates, maybe 20, 25, 30, whatever. Our weight on global GDP is 2%. So basically, even if we would allocate all our tax revenue to the protection and maintenance of our cultural heritage, figures would not match. So it's not a matter of accusing our government to be not able to allocate enough money to the cultural heritage, because we still have roads, schools, and hospitals, to say the least, to maintain and protect and build. But it's more like, first, finding better ways to raise revenue from our cultural heritage. Talking about, not an academic, because I am not, but an average tourist, and talking about my January experience. I was in Andalusia in January. The Alcazar of Granada was packed and sold out, but I was 7 meters from the entrance using an app, giving me real-time new available entrance, while reservations were not showing up on time. And I was able to enter the Alcazar within 7 minutes from arriving there and realizing it was sold out. And 20 days after, in my only Sunday in Florence, I tried unsuccessfully to visit the exhibition in Palazzo Medici Riccardi, because first, it was not possible to make a reservation for the same day, and second, it was sold out 24 hours before, and there was no way to access Palazzo Medici Riccardi, despite the thousands of no show up, according to the ladies at the entrance. So this is missing revenue. I'm a finance guy. We're already, 2% GDP against 20, 50, or whatever percent of worldwide cultural heritage. So first, let's manage our museums better. Let's make more branding. Let's raise more revenue. Second, and we will talk about that tomorrow, and this is the topic of my speech, of course, the private donations are very important, and we learned today how much is coming from the Friends of Florence, and it's just an outstanding example of what can be done, especially when we consider, for example, that the United States account for 22% of the global GDP, and for sure not 22% of the global cultural heritage, despite they're very well promoting their one. And this is just my little contribution as a finance guy. Finally, I have a question for you. I go back to my childhood when I just wanted to paint like a ghirlandaio, and I was not into law nor into figures. And I remember clearly that I was outraged by visiting the British Museum with my parents and finding there sculptures from the Parthenon, and delighted to find the charioteer of Delphi in situ, on site. Then after some years, I realized that for an American citizen of the beginning of the 20th century, the only access to culture was actually visiting institutions like the Met. So I understood that these museums were actually a mean of making culture globally available to anybody. So they were a weird way through which the empires achieved access to culture. Then I've been recently reading *Sapiens* by Professor Harari, and I was charmed by his pointing out that the Western empires were actually the first empires that actually took care of understanding the cultures that they were at the same time exploiting or even canceling from the world. It struck me that, you know, it was the British trying to decodify the cuneiform writing while all the local cultures were just ignoring thousands of years, for the exact 2,200 years of their history. So it's very complex, but now I think to myself that we don't need material access to cultural heritage in order to make it accessible worldwide. So what is it right? To bring the sculptures of the Parthenon back to Athens, or to respect the symbolic value of the Met? I'm just a lawyer with passion in finance, so I don't have the answer. Please answer me.
Thank you very much. And Emmanuel, you have to go?
Yes, well, no, the problem to me is I'm not sure if it's good to compare the Granada Alhambra with the exhibition of Donatello, because basically you would like...
Donatello it was Medici Riccardi. We are guiltless this time.
Benozzo Gozzoli. And so, because I was pretty sure that at that time there are plenty of empty museums in Florence or beyond, so probably the problem is that we have to invite people not to put the head on the same place, but to try to open up their mind and visit something without changing the city, because within the city of Florence. As for the restitution, I won't open up here the problem, because I think we will last our discussion, probably will last till tomorrow morning, because it's quite complicated. So, but I would like just to say that probably the things that managing better is not a question of only try to preventing solding out, whether to organize better our cultural offer in order to spread tourism in different places and not all in the same places.
Anybody else?
Well, to say something quickly about the contrast at the end between, you know, sort of, do we honor the British Museum because they saved something, or do we honor the importance of the site, right, and that connection? I just think that different times require different solutions, and we are at a time now where I think there's probably more to be gained. I haven't really thought about this until this very moment, from returning them, and the Elgin marbles, or the Elgin marbles, the Parthenon marbles. I mean, certainly, and it's partly because digitally as well, there's many ways in which we can all experience that culture, and of course it's not the same. Right? We all understand it's not the same to experience it digitally. Although some people, you know, sort of would actually prefer that approach. I mean, look at the, you know, rise of non-fungible tokens, which we will see tomorrow. They prefer to live their culture through a virtual world. I feel like we're all dinosaurs here because we like the tangible things that have real cultural sort of, you know, value in our hands or something. But anyway, so I think you just put your finger on different important roles and values, and it's not one or the other, but what's important at this moment in time, and what should the solution be, taking into account not what the British did when they did it, but what now is the right thing to do with respect to them. And maybe that means still leaving them in the British Museum, but at least I don't think we should be tied to to the historical experience of empire as the justification for the fact they're actually deeply part of British culture, right? So that's all.
If I can add one small comment on the financial side, it's true. I have to say, it's true. We need to learn to manage our museum, our cultural side better. I think we are all aware of that. And compared to many other European and overseas museums, we are technologically behind. That it's a matter of fact. We cannot deny that. We are all working on it. We can do better. We are trying to be better, but there are some legal issues, which I think tomorrow, I don't know if they are touched upon, but it's an invitation to our colleagues. What is peculiar of the Italian administration is that we have a very detailed codes of cultural heritage, and we updated it, but in terms of maintenance and legal and practical and administrative fact, we are like public offices. So museums are like schools, hospitals, etc., and this makes it incredibly hard to bridge that gap because we have to do all the complex bureaucratic steps. Some things are changing, but we don't have a fast track to do what you suggest. So I think that is fair enough, and from the legal and economic view, it should be something that it should be addressed and hopefully legally framed differently so that we can have our own sets of law, not to work as a state public office that is buying, I don't know, uniforms, but we are actually trying to buy services. So that it's a weak point. In terms of the funding, we are all increasing that, and there is a good tradition of that. In the last 40 years, I think that this has been done all over Italy. What I can tell you, and this brings back to the Italian United States, with the Friends of the Bargello, with other foreign institutions, there is the Italian Foundation of the Bargello, but a very smart patron in America whom I went to meet in New York, said, "Why should I give you money if your government invests such a small percentage in managing your cultural heritage?" I reported that, and I started fighting, so to speak, in terms of changing the attitude. In the last years, the ministry and the general budget of funds allocated to the cultural heritage has certainly increased, but that was also because we were after the big Italian crisis of 2008, which was a disaster for cultural heritage. They had to cut across the board. However, we will never bridge that gap, but I can see that patrons are more willing to give, as it should be right, when they realize that their own countries care. And I think this is our mission, to make understand that it's important to care, and governments worldwide need to care more about cultural heritage. Because when I said that American museums saw their staff cuts brutally, it was not because they wanted to, but because there was not enough national awareness of that importance. So it's always a balance, but you are right, we can do a better job, and we are trying to, but I think that we need a new legal sets of rules to do what you suggest, because we cannot be like any other public office dealing with these sets of rules. I don't know if you want to say.
Yes, I completely agree, but there is also, before, the need of a more balanced political choice, because if we focus always on the same few museums and sites, Pompeii, Uffizi, Brera, and so on, letting without resources and staff the minor museums altogether in institutions which have to manage 50 museums together, it is really impossible. So that there is no way to have in a single virtual place a general view of the enormous cultural offer of Italy. There were a couple of experiments, but without success, unfortunately. So there is a need of, you said, of a more general view, because there is also a common, un luogo comune, locus communis of the Italian patrimony is widespread, but there are no consequences. Everybody agrees, but in political terms, this is absolutely without, yes, has no influence on the political choices, because it's easier to have to say we have 1 million tickets from this museum than to have a policy for sharing on the territory of the entire region this, the public. So it is quite a difficult problem, I think.
Thank you, Paolo. I want to say goodbye to Emanuele Pellegrini. Thank you very much. He has to catch the train. We will accept another... We will accept another question or two, because we...
Thank you so much. Very brief question, and I'm sorry if I come back to the discourse that we were making before regarding how and why Italian state should be entitled, let's say, to protect or to valorize and to regulate heritage that was so dismembered. But I was digging in my Google Drive to find the references I had in mind, so I just came back to this now. And my very brief remark is that sometimes cultural heritage and cultural property, more specifically, can be used also in an instrumental way. So if we think, for example, on how all the cultural property, if we think about France, for example, and how all the cultural property that was belonging to the monarchy, for example, and then after French Revolution immediately came in the public property, and how French state was able to revindicate this and to establish its own identity on these collections that belonged to kings before. And the references I was looking for was of this researcher whose name is Fiona Greenlad, who was studying why in Italy, for example, our Code for Cultural Heritage and Landscape protects such humble objects such as pottery, for example, or other very small objects, while she was saying in Italy you have masterpieces, you have landscape, you have these beautiful frescoes, etc. So why your code wants to protect this very humble heritage? And her answer, the answer that she gave is this reason, is the instrumental reason of cultural property. So to find a legacy an ancient history, for example, and to find a legacy and a reason that these ancestor communities were on our land, let's say, on our territory that now became a national state, and so in order to trace this history also on a material way. So in a very nutshell, I think that we should also reflect on how cultural property should be used and has been used in other ways, maybe as they were before, so in an instrumental way. Thank you.
Any remark or question? You want to wrap up? Yeah? You all want to conclude with some words? No? Okay, thank you very much. So please join me in thanking our participants around table. Thank you very much for a very dense first half day of conference, and
thank you to the audience also.
Thank you for the audience to endure, and
debate.
we'll join tomorrow at 9. Thank you very much.
Thank you.